There was a legend that spoke of a demon king who once asked a mage what drove mages to go to such lengths. The mage answered that there was something she wanted and needed to protect. With that mindset, her power flowed without limits. She would fight the demon king and protect everyone. The demon king was eventually destroyed after being struck by the mage's holy lightning, and their battle came to an end. Fajiti was a city located in the southern region of the Alzano Kingdom. This city was born and developed alongside the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy. That day, Rumia saw a man who had hurt his finger while trying to light a fire. She approached him and healed the wound using her magic. The Alzano Kingdom was known as the center of magical power because the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy had been standing for over 400 years. Thanks to Rumia's spell, the man's injury healed completely. He guessed that Rumia must have been a student at the academy and praised her for her skills. Rumia told him that, in reality, using magic outside the academy was forbidden, and she asked him to keep it a secret. The man thanked her just as Sistine came over. Rumia then said goodbye to the man before continuing on with Sistine. The academy was not only proud of its long history, but was also a center for advanced magical studies, praised as one of the most prestigious schools. Many well-known mages were alumni of the academy. As Rumia and Sistine walked to school, Sistine wondered why Rumia had not gone on ahead as she had asked. Rumia explained that she could not leave the daughter of the house she was staying in by herself. Sistine told her not to say things like that, even as a joke, because she already thought of Rumia as family. Rumia apologized. Rumia then mentioned that it was unusual for Sistine to forget something. Perhaps it was because of that matter. Their teacher, Mr. Huey, had suddenly retired, and today they would have a substitute teacher. Sistine hoped the substitute would be like Mr. Huey. As they were walking, a man suddenly came running toward them. Sistine quickly used her magic to throw him into the air, and he landed in a nearby fountain. Rumia quietly asked Sistine if she might have gone too far, and Sistine admitted that she had. They went over to the man, who was now soaking wet but thankfully unharmed. The man asked if they were all right and warned them to be careful since cutting across like that could be dangerous. Sistine was confused because it was the man who had been charging toward them, but Rumia pointed out that Sistine had attacked with magic without warning and suggested they apologize. Instead, the man became even more smug, insisting it was their fault. He then placed a hand on Rumia's shoulder, saying she looked familiar. Seeing his lack of manners, Sistine once again used her magic to send him flying into the air, annoyed that he had touched a girl so casually. Meanwhile, Harley expressed his doubts about the new substitute teacher to Rick, the head of the academy. Rick explained that the substitute had been personally recommended by Professor Celica. In Rumia and Sistine's class, all the students were waiting for the new teacher. More than half the class period had passed, yet the teacher still had not arrived. Rumia began to worry that something might have happened, while Wendy noted that it was rare for an academy teacher to be late. Before long, the substitute finally arrived. Sistine immediately called him out for being late. Both she and Rumia were stunned to see that it was the same man from that morning. He introduced himself as the substitute teacher and the one in charge of their class. His name was Glenn. He explained that he would be teaching them for the next month and started to share details about his skills and hobbies, but Sistine cut him off and told him to skip the self-introduction and get straight to the lesson. At that time, Rick mentioned that it shouldn't be a problem if the substitute teacher came recommended by the professor. He also pointed out that the teacher's magic capacity and skills were nothing special. If classified, he would only be a level 3 mage. Holly was surprised, wondering why a level 3 mage would be teaching at this academy when even the lowest-ranked instructors were at least level 4, with many being level 5 or 6. Hallie questioned whether this substitute could really teach the academy's gifted students, saying he might just have them study on their own while he relaxed and had tea. Later in class, Glenn wrote the words self-study on the blackboard and told the students to study on their own that day because he planned to take a nap. The students were baffled, and Sistine immediately grew irritated, throwing a book at him. Around that time, Rick explained to Hallie that the substitute didn't have an official teaching license. Still, for Rick, the professor's recommendation was what mattered most. Rick explained that the substitute was once a prodigy, accepted into the academy at age 11, leaving at 15, but his activities for the next 4 years were unknown. Hearing this, Hallie concluded that the substitute had been wasting his time and was an unreliable mage. Hallie even asked Rick, as the head of the academy, if he truly trusted that so-called old witch. Unexpectedly, Celica stepped in, telling Hallie to watch his words. Hallie was startled to see her there and asked how long she had been listening. Celica said she didn't care if Hallie spoke poorly about her, but she wouldn't forgive anyone who insulted the substitute in front of her. She commanded that Hallie take back his words. Seeing her stern stance, Hallie left the headmaster's office. Celica apologized to Rick, and Rick admitted Hallie's reaction wasn't surprising. After all, the academy had just hired a mage without teaching experience. Celica said she would take responsibility for whatever the Academy achieved under these circumstances. Rick was curious why she was going so far and asked what Glenn meant to her. Celica replied there was nothing special between them. She simply wanted Glenn to live his life to the fullest. When Glenn began teaching, he wrote on the board in such poor handwriting that it was impossible to read. The students commented that they had never seen anyone look so unmotivated before. Wendy was baffled at how unserious he was, especially after getting smacked by Sistine earlier. His teaching style was confusing, and his eyes looked completely lifeless. Lynn then asked Glenn a question about a rune alphabet spell he had just explained, saying she didn't understand how to translate it into everyday language. Glenn casually said he didn't know either and told her to figure it out herself. Annoyed, Sistine asked if that was really an appropriate teacher's response. Glenn simply replied that he didn't know, and when Sistine told him to find the answer and explain it in the next class, he argued it would be faster for her to look it up on her own. Rubia had to calm Sistine down, and Glenn asked whether anyone had ever taught them how to use a dictionary. The bell rang and Glenn ended the lesson, making Sistine even more frustrated. Yeeple even muttered that Glenn was an irresponsible teacher. After that, the girls in Sistine's class began changing clothes for their upcoming alchemy practice, with Glenn assigned as the supervisor. Sistine, still irritated, jokingly teased Rumia about her figure, making lighthearted comments about how it seemed different from her own. Rubia told her to knock it off, but Sistine kept going with her playful remarks. Suddenly, Glenn barged in, kicking the door open, and questioned why they even needed to change clothes for alchemy practice. When he saw the girls were mid-change, he quickly covered his eyes and awkwardly asked why people always panicked and made a big deal over these situations. His clumsy attempt at humor only annoyed the girls further, and Sistine promptly shoved him right back out of the room. During lunch break, Sistine was feeling annoyed because the planned alchemy practice ended up being cancelled, even though she had been eager to study seriously. Rudia came over carrying lunch, fully understanding how dedicated Sistine was to her studies, but suggesting she should eat first. At that moment, Sistine was still thinking about the promise she had made to her grandfather to uncover the mystery of the Melgalia Sky Castle, and how she needed to master a lot of magic in order to achieve it. Suddenly, Glenn showed up at their table to eat. Seeing how much food he had, Rubia asked if he liked eating that much. Glenn admitted that eating was one of his favorite things. Rubia laughed, commenting that the stir-fry he was eating looked delicious. Glenn mentioned that it was the season for killua beans. He offered some to Rubia, and after taking a bite, she admitted it really was tasty. Glenn then pointed out that Sistine's portion seemed too small to be filling. Sistine shot back that he had no right to comment on her food, and that her smaller portions wouldn't make her sleepy during lessons, but if Glenn's lessons came afterward, she wouldn't mind eating more. Glenn said she was overcomplicating things and told her to just say what she meant. When she was about to speak, Glenn suddenly popped a spoonful of killua bean stir-fry into her mouth. Sistine was clearly irritated, but Glenn didn't pay it any mind. Meanwhile, Celica still had Glenn on her mind. She had previously offered him the position of substitute teacher. Glenn told her it was impossible because he wasn't fit to teach anyone. Celica responded that he didn't have the right to refuse, even joking that she would threaten him with lightning, fire, or ice if she had to. Glenn begged her to let him off, saying he didn't want to work. Celica immediately launched a magical attack his way. Luckily, it missed, but after that, Glenn couldn't avoid the job anymore. That afternoon, Glenn was back teaching Sistine's class. But for the 3 full periods, he only told the students to study on their own. Unable to hold back her frustration any longer, Sistine stood up and introduced herself as a noble daughter from the prestigious Phoebale family of mages, a name of significant influence at the academy. She even said she would report Glenn to her father to have him fired, though she wouldn't do that if he acted like a real teacher. Unexpectedly, Glenn told her to go ahead and tell her father, saying he was looking forward to it. He even seemed happy about the idea of getting fired soon. In response, Sistine threw her glove in Glenn's face, signaling a formal challenge to a magic duel. Glenn asked if she was serious. At that moment, Rumia stepped in to stop her, asking Sistine to apologize to Glenn and take back her glove. Glenn then asked what Sistine really wanted. She said she only wanted him to change his attitude and start teaching seriously. Glenn countered by saying that if he won, Sistine would have to agree to his request. Cash was surprised by Glenn's attitude, while Cecil thought he looked like he was plotting something a bit harsh. Coming from the Phoebale noble family, Sistine couldn't stand someone like Glenn who disrespected magic. Glenn was surprised that anyone still followed the old tradition of throwing down a glove to challenge someone, but he accepted. The rest of the class was shocked. No one had ever seen a duel between a student and a teacher before. They quickly headed to the courtyard. Glenn said he wasn't fond of hurting kids and insisted they could only use the shockbolt spell. Sistine didn't mind. Cecil asked Cash who he thought would win, and Cash was certain it would be Glenn. Terasal wondered if Glenn was intentionally making it harder for Sistine by limiting the fight to Shock Bolt, but Giebel wasn't so sure, explaining that Shock Bolt was actually a versatile spell and one of the first defensive spells they learned, using electricity to incapacitate the opponent. The usual incantation was "O Spirit of Thunder, strike with your electric shock and paralyze them." In a real fight, though, the winner was usually decided by who could shorten the incantation and cast faster, meaning Glenn must have been confident in his casting speed, especially since he had been personally recommended by Professor Celica. Glenn told Sistine she could attack from any direction. Sistine refused to back down, thinking to herself that as long as she stayed true to who she was, she would never allow a man like Glenn to roam free. Even if she were humiliated, she would still refuse to give in, because her pride as a mage was on the line. Sistine cast a spell and aimed her magic attack at Glenn. Glenn simply smiled, and the magic struck his body. He collapsed instantly. Startled, Sistine asked if she had broken any rules. Glenn tried to get back on his feet and explained that he had intentionally let her win the first round since the match had 3 rounds in total. In the second round, Glenn attempted to cast his spell, but Sistine was faster. Once again, her magic hit him squarely. Glenn hadn't expected Sistine to be that skilled, so he suggested making it a 5-round match. Trying to trick her, Glenn then went on the offensive, but he was still slower in casting his spell. Her magic struck him yet again. Seeing this, Sistine suspected that Glenn might not be able to cast the Shock Bolt spell in a single phrase. Glenn denied it, saying that shortening an incantation was considered taboo, but that didn't mean he couldn't do it. However, all the students realized that he really couldn't. Sistine declared herself the winner of the duel and told Glenn to act like a proper teacher tomorrow. Glenn claimed he had never promised anything and didn't even know what she was talking about. He acknowledged Sistine's talent, forgave her, and said their duel was a draw. Then, without warning, he made a run for it. That day, Sistine was deeply disappointed in him. That day, Glenn was back teaching Sistine's class, and as usual, he just told the students to study on their own. Sistine was baffled. Even after losing a duel against him, Glenn still acted the same way. She couldn't believe he was ignoring a mage's agreement. Lynn came over to Glenn's desk to ask about something she didn't understand, but Sistine said it was pointless to ask him anything. She believed Glenn didn't even understand the greatness or depth of magic and offered to teach Lynn herself. Seeing this, Glenn asked if Sistine's magic was really that amazing. Sistine explained that magic was a study about the very foundation of the world and the answer to the timeless question of why they and the world existed. She said magic was a way for humans to find a path to a higher level of existence. Glenn then asked what the point was in studying the foundations of the world. Sistine replied that she had already explained it. It was to reach that higher level. Glenn asked what higher level meant. Was it becoming a god? And what real benefits did magic bring to humanity? He gave an example. Medical science could save people from illness, agriculture and architecture could benefit society in countless ways, but magic, in his view, had no real use. Sistine insisted magic wasn't that shallow. It was about searching for the meaning of the world and humanity itself. But Glenn was only baiting her. He suddenly claimed that magic was useful for killing people. The whole class froze in shock. Glenn went on, saying that while swordsmanship might kill 1 person, magic could kill 10, and no other field could match it in that regard. He added that magic was deeply connected to killing, and that it was a worthless field that had advanced by taking lives. He honestly didn't understand how people could spend their whole lives studying something so pointless. Unable to accept that, Sistine slapped him hard, tears welling up in her eyes before she ran out of the classroom. That afternoon, Glenn started reflecting on what was so great about magic. He realized the problem wasn't with magic. It was with his own immaturity. He decided to finish his work for the day, and after that, he knew he'd have to make it up to Celica. If he worked hard enough, he was sure she'd forgive him. While wandering through the academy, Glenn spotted Rumia in a room, drawing a magic circle. He immediately went over. Rumia apologized, saying she just wanted to practice making one. Glenn agreed to supervise. Rumia told him the magic circle wasn't working at all. Glenn explained she was missing Mercury. In his view, students often focused too much on invisible concepts while ignoring what was right in front of them, and that proved they tended to overestimate magic. After pouring Mercury into the circle, he told her to try again using the full 5-word arrangement from the textbook, without abbreviating anything. When Rumia recited the spell, the circle lit up beautifully. It was the first time she had ever seen such a perfect magic circle. Glenn told her that anyone could do it. Seeing how happy she was with her first successful magic circle reminded him of the first one he had ever created. On their way home together, Rumia asked if Glenn actually liked magic, since she'd seen him smiling earlier, but Glenn insisted he hated it. She then asked what he had been doing before becoming a teacher at the academy. Glenn admitted he had just been a shut-in, living off others, and that he had been relying on Celica for a whole year. When Rumia tried to dig deeper, Glenn told her not to ask about his past. Instead, Glenn asked why Rumia and her friends were so obsessed with magic, when in his opinion it didn't deserve such admiration. Rumia explained that she wanted to make magic truly useful for humanity. To do that, she needed to understand it better. He also had a debt to repay to someone. When Glenn asked what she meant, Rumia told him that 3 years ago, she had been exiled from her home. Around the time she started living with Sistine, she was captured by an evil mage and almost lost her life, until a heroic mage appeared and saved her. The hero defeated the evil sorcerers one by one. At that moment, Rumia was terrified. But once she realized that the hero had saved her, she felt a strong desire to lead humanity so it wouldn't fall behind in the study of magic. To do that, she knew she had to deepen her understanding of magic. She believed that was the only way she could truly thank the man who had rescued her. In her heart, she thought of him as the one who brought light when she had been crying alone in the dark. That night, Rumia reminded Glenn to apologize to Sistine. She told him it mattered because Sistine had a deep connection with her late grandfather through her magic, and that bond was important to her. It turned out that Sistine's grandfather had once told her the reason he became a mage was to reach the celestial castle of Melgalius. When she was a child, Sistine had told him that she would become an even greater mage than he was and uncover the secrets of that floating castle. The next day, Glenn apologized to Sistine in front of the whole class. He admitted he had gone too far, and after that, he began the day's lesson. But before starting, he bluntly told the students that they were all fools, which naturally shocked everyone. He explained that after observing how they studied, it was obvious to him that they didn't truly understand magic. The students weren't happy about being called out like that. Hebel, for instance, couldn't believe those words had come from a third-rate mage who supposedly couldn't even recite a single line of the Shockbolt spell. Glenn decided to prove a point. He started with the Shockbolt incantation and called them fools again for not realizing something so simple. He recited the standard 3-line spell and cast it. Hearing this, Teresa dismissed it as unimpressive because he had taken 3 lines to do it, and Wendy smugly claimed they had all mastered it long ago. Glenn pointed out that those with proper control could shorten it to 2 lines, but then he posed a question. What would happen if a 3-line spell was expanded into 4 lines instead? Hebel quickly replied that the spell would fail, and Glenn agreed, but asked if they knew exactly what kind of failure it would be. Wendy confidently said the magic would just go wild. Glenn doubted her supposed mastery of Shockbolt, then demonstrated what he meant, casting a 4-line version, which caused the bolt to curve off course. Everyone was stunned. He went on to explain that making it 5 lines reduced the attack's range, and removing even a single word caused the effect to vanish quickly. Glenn told them that magic was essentially an evolved form of automatic suggestion, and that the runic language used for incantations was the most effective tool for activating it. This language reached into the subconscious mind, allowing one to influence the fundamental principles of the world. Magic, he said, wasn't about studying the principles of the world, it was about exploring the human heart. Seeing the students still doubtful that ordinary words could have such power, Glenn gave an example. He casually called Sistine White Cat, which made her visibly annoyed. Then with a straight face, he told her he had loved her from the first time they met. In an instant, the white cat turned bright red. That, he said, was proof that ordinary words could influence someone's mind. Sistine promptly threw a book at his head in frustration. Glenn explained that magic worked a lot like grammar and sentence structure. Both could shape the subconscious however one wanted. He gave another demonstration, surprising the class when he managed to cast a spell while speaking in a lazy, almost careless tone. The trick, he told them, was to let the subconscious handle the incantation. He then asked what came to their minds when they heard the words white cat. The same principle applied to spells. If they understood the meaning behind them, pronunciation wouldn't be hard. But if they ignored the fundamentals and only memorized what was in the books, then their learning process would be foolish. In his view, they were nothing more than mages who could only parrot incantations. After that, Glenn began teaching them the true basics. Rick acknowledged Glenn's talent in teaching, and Celica wasn't surprised at all since Glenn had always been gifted at guiding other students. Celica even mentioned that Glenn was the best student she had ever taught from the very beginning. Unfortunately, Hallie didn't share that sentiment and was even planning to have Glenn expelled from the academy. Meanwhile, Glenn explained to his students that most of them tended to see both common and unique magic as something impressive, when in fact it wasn't always that great, especially if they skipped over mastering common magic first. Without that foundation, using advanced magic would be pointless. That afternoon, Glenn sat on the school rooftop, lost in thought about Rumia and Sistine. Celica came over and asked if he was spending his youth daydreaming, since lately he seemed a bit more energetic. She teased him, saying that before this, he'd been like a fish dead for a month, but now he was like a fish dead for just a day. Glenn apologized for troubling her. Celica then told him she would be leaving the next day for a magic negotiation. Since Huey would also be away, the class Glenn was teaching would have an extra lesson. She reminded him not to do anything strange with the students while they were gone. Glenn replied that it would never happen, especially since he was used to seeing women like Celica and therefore wouldn't be interested in ordinary girls. Hearing that, Celica suddenly hugged him from behind. Glenn felt uncomfortable and quickly freed himself from her arms. Not long after, Rumia and Sistine showed up to greet them. Rumia wanted to ask something, but Glenn, in his usual smug tone, said that a great teacher like him would be giving advice to his foolish student. Sistine was clearly annoyed by his behavior. Later that night, while Rumia was brushing Sistine's hair, she mentioned that Glenn's explanations were easy to understand. Sistine admitted Glenn was great as a teacher, but terrible as an ordinary person. Rumia suddenly brought up the time when she had first come to Sistine's house and they weren't close yet. Over time, they grew more comfortable with each other, so Rumia was confident that Glenn could eventually get along with Sistine too. Sistine, however, wasn't interested in that idea. That night, Lake, Carol, and Jin discussed a plan that had been delayed because Celica had taken Glenn with her. They decided to proceed with it the next day when the magic negotiations began. The next morning, Glenn ran to school because he was late. When he arrived, he called out for someone to come out, saying he could see through their hiding spot. The person turned out to be Carol, who praised Glenn for spotting him even though he had been using a quick defensive spell. Glenn asked who he was, but Carol refused to give his name, saying that his only goal was to kill him. Carol then immediately attacked Glenn with his magic. Meanwhile, in the classroom, Sistine wondered why Glenn had been so popular lately. Rumia teased her, asking if Glenn's fame was making her feel lonely. Sistine denied it. Suddenly, Jin and Lake entered the class, claiming that their teacher couldn't make it, so they would be substituting. Sistine scolded them, reminding them that outsiders weren't allowed in the school. Without warning, Jin launched a magic attack that nearly hit her. Sistine realized that the magic was military grade. Jin threatened to deal with anyone who resisted and said they were looking for a girl named Rumia. Naturally, no one admitted anything. He then questioned Lin, but she refused to tell him anything. Sistine asked what they wanted with Rumia, which seemed to annoy Jin, and he prepared to attack her. Seeing this, Rumia stepped forward and admitted her identity. Jin said he already knew which girl was Rumia. He had just been toying with the idea of harming innocent people. Lake told Jin to stop fooling around, and then they asked Rumia to come with them. Sistine tried to stop her from going, but Rumia said she believed that Glenn would come to save them. Jin then claimed that he had already killed Glenn, which left both Rumia and Sistine in shock. Left with no choice, Rumia went with them. She asked why they were after her, and Lake explained that Rumia, better known to him as Princess Ermiana, was not supposed to be alive. If she had been allowed to live, there had to be a reason. At that moment, Jin seized Sistine and dragged her into a room with bad intentions. Sistine declared that she was the daughter of the noble female family. Jin admitted that Rumia wasn't his type because she looked fragile, though she had a strong spirit. On the other hand, Sistine might seem strong, but in his eyes, she was just a girl hiding her weakness behind a mask, and he liked girls like that. Sistine firmly stated she wouldn't give in. But when Jadis tore her clothes and tried to get closer, she desperately pleaded with Jin to stop. Jin was surprised that she seemed to give up so quickly. With tears in her eyes, Sistine wished someone would help her. Just as Jin was about to go further, Glenn suddenly swung the door open, casually apologizing for interrupting. Sistine quickly begged him for help. But as Glenn stepped forward, she suddenly urged him to run, warning that Jin's power was far beyond his. Jin hurled a spell at Glenn, but it had no effect, no matter how many times he tried. Glenn explained that magic wouldn't work on him because he was using Arcana card to seal all magic within a certain range around him. It was his own original spell called the Fool's World. Jin was stunned, wondering just how powerful Glenn really was. Even Sistine was shocked. If Glenn could seal magic, it meant he couldn't be beaten by any mage. But Glenn admitted that the spell also affected him, meaning he couldn't use magic either. Jin laughed at the irony, asking how a mage could fight after sealing his own magic. In response, Glenn charged at him and landed a series of barehanded blows, taking him down with ease. Jin was left wondering who Glenn really was and why he could fight like a soldier from the royal army. Glenn introduced himself as a substitute teacher, and Jin realized that meant Glenn had already defeated Carol. He was shocked that a mage would choose to challenge someone using only punches. Glenn then said that if Jin didn't want to lose to a punch, then he should get ready to be defeated by a magical punch, which, in a surprising twist, turned out to be a kick. Glenn managed to take down Jin without using any magic. He knew Sistine must have been terrified after what almost happened to her, so he asked if she was hurt. Sistine assured him she was fine. Glenn thought she might say he wasn't fit to teach anyone since his hands had just been used for violence, but instead she pointed out that his pants had slipped down. Sistine then mentioned there was still one more person who had taken Rumia, and it seemed Glenn would be interrogating Jin later. Not long after, Celica finally managed to contact Glenn after he'd been having trouble reaching her. Glenn explained that the intruders had broken through the protective barrier, isolating the academy, and had taken the students hostage. Celica asked if Glenn knew who the intruders were. Seeing the tattoo on Jin's body, Glenn told her they were members of the Heavenly Gospel, a secret society of dark mages, a notorious terrorist group in the Empire's history. These intruders shouldn't have been able to get past the Academy's magic defenses, which meant someone on the inside was helping them. Glenn asked Celica to investigate any suspicious instructors and request assistance from the Magic Court, but she said she couldn't because she was just a regular teacher without that kind of authority. Glenn urged her to come to the Academy using a magic circle. Celica told him to calm down, explaining that if the barrier had already been destroyed, the teleportation circles were likely the first thing the intruders would have taken out. Still, she promised she'd hurry there and told Glenn not to die. At that moment, Glenn noticed Sistine staring off in thought. She asked if they weren't going to get any help. Then, without warning, she bolted off, determined to rescue Rumia. Glenn stopped her, telling her it would be suicide. Frustrated and in tears, Sistine admitted he was right, that magic felt useless and was now putting Rumia in danger. Glenn told her not to cry. He reminded her that Rumia wanted to make magic something that could help people, and because of that, she wanted to understand it better. For that reason alone, Glenn said he wouldn't let Rumia die. He promised to take down the two enemies that were left. Suddenly, Jin started laughing, saying that Glenn was just an ordinary man like him. Sistine disagreed, saying Glenn was nothing like Jin or the others, but Jin insisted that Glenn was the same kind of scoundrel and killer as he was. Out of nowhere, a portal appeared, bringing in an army of skeletal golems. Jin grinned, thinking his reinforcements had arrived, but the golems immediately turned on him and killed him instead. Sistine froze in shock, and Glenn quickly pulled her back. He punched one of the golems, only to find its bones were incredibly tough. Sistine lent her magic power to help him, and Glenn smashed one of the golems to pieces with a single blow. Glenn then told Sistine they needed to run, but the skeletal army kept chasing them. Glenn decided to hold them off and told Sistine to use the Gale Blow spell, but to make it wider and last longer. Sistine was confused about why it had to be so complicated, and Glenn warned he'd dock her grade if she couldn't do it. Determined, Sistine agreed to try. While Glenn fought off the golems, Sistine chanted her spell. Once it was ready, Glenn told her to unleash a storm barrier to trap them. The golems weren't completely stopped, and Sistine apologized, but Glenn said it was enough and asked her to keep it going. He then began chanting a high-level incantation, unleashing a modified black magic spell called Extinction Ray, an attack powerful enough to erase the skeletal army and take out part of the school building in the process. Sistine never expected Glenn to pull off such a high-level spell, but right after that, Glenn suddenly collapsed and coughed up blood. He had pushed himself way too far, burning through all of his mana by forcing a spell that was well beyond his limits. Glenn tried to get Sistine to move somewhere safer, but suddenly Lake showed up, his sword magic already activated. Lake admitted that he had underestimated Glenn, who somehow managed to use the Extinction Ray despite being only a third-class mage. He also hadn't expected Glenn to have defeated Carol and Jin. Glenn asked Sistine if she was strong enough to neutralize Lake's sword magic with Dispel Force. Sistine honestly said there was no chance of that happening. Glenn then pushed her out of the way. Lake asked why Glenn wasn't running. He said he knew Glenn could use the Fool's World spell to cancel magic, but that technique didn't work once a spell was already active. Lake then sent his swords flying, and one of them managed to cut Glenn. If Glenn had been able to use Fool's World, those swords wouldn't have done a thing. Glenn tried to cast Red Lion, but Lake quickly disrupted it. Lake called Glenn slow and started casting Red Lion himself, but Glenn immediately countered with Savage Lightning Emperor and a Spear of Light aimed straight at him. Lake blocked with both swords. He figured it was safer to evade using his swords, because if he tried to continue with magic, Glenn would just nullify it and force him into a physical fight. On the other hand, if Lake stuck to sword combat, he risked taking a direct hit from Lightning Pierce. Lake was now curious about who Glenn really was. Glenn simply said he was just a substitute teacher. Lake didn't buy it. He then launched all four of his swords toward Glenn. Glenn tried to cast Dispel Force, but before he could finish, the swords pierced him. Lake realized Glenn was completely out of energy. Fortunately, Sistine had been quietly casting Dispel Force herself, restoring Glenn's strength. Grabbing one of the swords, Glenn dashed straight toward Lake. Lake tried to reactivate his sword magic, but Glenn was already right in front of him and drove the blade into his body. In that moment, Lake remembered hearing about a skilled mage killer working with a court mage course. Then he collapsed. Glenn hated having to do something so unpleasant, but he was relieved Sistine had understood what he was trying to do earlier. After Sistine had fallen, she realized she had only been a burden to him. But she also remembered his earlier question about neutralizing Lake's sword magic with Dispel Force, which told her that if Glenn had only been trying to help her escape, he wouldn't have asked that at all. After that, Glenn told her they needed to get moving. Sistine warned him he wasn't in any shape to fight, but he said there was no time to think about that. Before long, pain hit him again. Sistine tried to heal him with magic. Glenn muttered that all he'd ever wanted was to be a heroic mage. Eventually, both of them drifted off to sleep. When Glenn woke up, he got a call from Celica, who asked about the situation. She told him the teleportation circle had indeed been destroyed, and that she was currently trying to gather reinforcements. She also explained that a barrier had been set up around the school to stop anyone from escaping. Glenn asked where the teleportation circle near the school was located. Celica told him it was at the top of a very tall tower. Glenn said it hadn't actually been destroyed. The destination point had simply been reset to create an escape route. Celica wasn't convinced, saying that would take at least half a day. Glenn glanced over at Sistine, who was still asleep, and quietly thanked her, feeling grateful she was with him. He then decided it was time to go see Rumia. Without wasting another second, Glenn sprinted toward the tall tower. When he arrived, he found Rumia being held captive. Rumia felt relieved because Glenn had come to save her. At that moment, Glenn just realized that the mastermind behind everything was Huey, the teacher who suddenly retired. Glenn thought that just having a handsome face was already a problem for Huey, let alone all of his evil deeds, which had completely drained his patience. Glenn used the Fool's World spell to seal the magic, but it turned out that the magic circle's inscription would be finished in 10 minutes. At that time, Rumia would be transferred to their organization, and the white magic ritual called Sacrifice would activate, consuming her soul to generate mana that would blow up the entire academy. Rumia begged Huey to stop his plan. Then Glenn realized that Huey was the missing teacher before he arrived. He would explain that the human bomb had been planted a year ago, prepared for the right moment. Glenn called Huey and his group the Sky Virtue Investigators, basically a bunch of fools. Huey said it was a game. If Glenn could cancel the magic circle binding Rumia, then the sacrifice wouldn't activate. But if Glenn waited for the Fool's World to run out of time, the cancellation wouldn't be in time. Glenn got frustrated because he was given such a tough choice. Rumia urged Glenn to run away so she could survive. Huey also warned that Glenn couldn't kill him because if Huey died, all the magic binding Rumia would activate immediately. With no other choice, Glenn bit his hand to draw blood. Rumia was obviously shocked to see this. Glenn quickly wrote a spell using his blood to break the magic circle. Huey didn't expect Glenn to use his own blood as the trigger and admitted it was an extraordinary method. The spell Glenn recited was meant to break the magic circle and calm the foundation of all the principles. Glenn succeeded, but Huey told him to hurry because that was only one layer of the circle, and there were 5 layers total. Hearing this, Glenn got even more annoyed and immediately started writing the spell with his blood on the next magic circle. Rumia felt very worried about Glenn's condition and asked him to save himself, but Glenn told her to be quiet. Rumia warned that if Glenn kept using the magic like this, he might die. Glenn replied that if he died, Sistine would probably be happy. Rumia started crying and asked why Glenn was willing to go so far and even sacrifice himself. Glenn confessed that he always wanted to be a heroic mage, but the magic world was a dirty and bloody place. He realized he had wasted his life, but despite that, he refused to give up. He said if he ran away now, the life he spent trying to be a hero would be meaningless, and he didn't want that to happen. That was when Glenn felt extremely frustrated. Glenn got his spirit back because there was only one last layer of the magic circle left. Unfortunately, he was vomiting blood and had no strength left. Rumia screamed hysterically, seeing Glenn helpless. Glenn even tried crawling closer to the magic circle, but he couldn't reach it because he was out of mana. Glenn apologized to Rumia and immediately lost consciousness. Rumia shouted Glenn's name and pushed through her pain to pull her hand out of the magic circle. He was shocked by what Rumia did. Her hand finally reached Glenn, and she knew it was because Glenn wouldn't give up that her hand could reach him. She started restoring Glenn's strength. Slowly, the power she gave flowed into Glenn's body. Seeing this, Hugh became even more scared. Not long after, Glenn woke up. It turned out that Rumia had saved him. Glenn had heard before about someone with a special ability to increase the power of those she touched. Glenn got back up and quickly wrote his blood on the magic circle to break the last layer. The magic circle shattered and the blast spread out of the tower. Sistine saw the explosion from below. Huey admitted defeat and asked whether he would die for following the organization's orders or for betraying the academy. Glenn didn't care. He felt pity but said it was all Huey's fault for not choosing his own path, so he had to pay for his bad actions himself. Glenn then punched Huey in the face, knocking him down. Soon after, Sistine came up to the tower and approached Rumia. Rumia asked Sistine to be quiet because Glenn was sleeping on her lap. Sistine was very grateful to Glenn for saving her. The next day, Glenn found out that Rumia, who was said to have died from illness 3 years ago, was actually Ermiana's daughter. Celica explained that the punishment for those with special abilities was still very harsh, especially if an entire noble family was angered. At the school, only Celica and the principal knew the truth about this. Glenn didn't really care about that, but Celica asked why he still wanted to be a teacher despite everything. Not long after, Glenn heard Rumia's voice calling him from downstairs. It turned out Sistine wanted to ask about the lesson Glenn had just explained. Glenn admitted that he wanted to keep teaching because he was curious to see what his students would achieve, and because it suited his free time well. He quickly went to meet the two of them, and Rumia deliberately pushed Sistine towards Glenn. After that, Glenn went on to meet other students who had questions about the lesson. That day at the royal palace, Queen Alicia was feeling anxious and wanted to visit the Royal Alzana Magic Academy. At the same time, Zelos was walking down the palace hallway with Eleanor. He asked Eleanor why Queen Alicia was so eager to go there. Eleanor explained that Zelos surely knew the girl who caused all the commotion was Princess Erminia's daughter. Zelos then realized that Queen Alicia was worried about the princess's safety. They immediately went to see Queen Alicia. Zelos, as the Empire's highest commander of the Imperial Guards, approached her regarding the Royal Alzana Magic Academy. He assured the queen that he would protect her safety throughout the journey and the competition. Queen Alicia thanked him for his dedication. Zelos was about to say something else, but Queen Alicia already knew about the girl who was rumored to have died. Zelos mentioned that only a few people in the kingdom knew about that, and that he understood the visit was meant to reveal the true identity of that girl. Queen Alicia ended their conversation by saying she would always remember Zelos' advice, and Zelos then left. Queen Alicia was convinced that the princess hated her. Even though she was despised and unforgiven, she still wished for the princess to be happy and healthy. The Magic Academy was going to hold a magic competition that involved each school. That day, Rumia and Sistine asked their friends who would be contributing to the competition. Sistine asked who wanted to join the flying race or the transformation contest, but all their classmates remained silent. Sistine felt very discouraged, especially since the competition was only 1 week away. Rudy encouraged everyone to try their best, but they had already lost hope. Sistine added that if it wasn't the only reason, Teresa admitted she didn't really want to participate. Rubia insisted that it was still a great opportunity, especially since many of them did not join last year. According to Giebel, Rubia and Sistine should not be so enthusiastic that they ended up embarrassing themselves just because the queen was visiting. That's what happens when they act too kindly and try to involve everyone. Soon after, Glenn arrived in the classroom and offered to take charge of the competition. Confidently, Glenn even called himself an excellent teacher. He asked Sistine, whom he nicknamed White Cat, to give him the list of competitions. Sistine disliked being called that, but Glenn promised he would make sure they all won the contest. Therefore, he insisted that no one should joke around and that everyone must be serious about the competition. Glenn announced that the participants for the duel and the highest scorers were Sistine, Giebel, and Cash. Wendy was assigned to the spell deciphering contest. The magic racing competitors were Rod, and Kai Cecil was selected for the archery competition. Teresa was chosen for the long-distance heavy lifting contest. Ruvia was the only one qualified for the mental restraint event. Glenn also asked Lynn to be the contestant for the transformation competition. Rubia felt touched that Glenn made sure everyone participated. After Glenn assigned everyone, Wendy suddenly objected, asking why she was not included in the duel. Glenn explained that although Wendy's spell knowledge and lists were excellent, she was somewhat slow, careless, and sometimes hesitant when casting spells. Therefore, Glenn chose Cash for the duel because he had quick reflexes and good decision-making skills. However, Wendy excelled in reading ancient languages, so Glenn asked her to score high in the quick spell deciphering contest. Hearing this, Wendy understood the reasoning. Glenn also mentioned that the magic race would involve black magic controlling gravity and was confident that Rod and Kai could handle it. He said Teresa had a talent for long-distance manipulation spells. Glenn believed that Alf Bix and Sicer, who were always together, were perfect for the Granzia contest, which required strong teamwork, especially since the three of them were very coordinated. Sistine realized that Glenn was paying attention to all of them. Although Glenn was a lousy teacher, he turned out to be quite good after all. Once everything was decided, Glenn assured them all that they would succeed. Before this, Glenn had asked Rick for an advance payment because he was out of money and hungry. However, Rick said the academy did not give advance salaries. Celica blamed Glenn and told him to manage on his own. Glenn blamed Celica, but she refused to accept the blame and grabbed Glenn's head. Rick then mentioned that there would be special rewards in next week's magic competition. Usually, the teacher of the winning class would get that special reward. That motivation made Glenn excited to win. Suddenly, Giebel asked Glenn to stop everything. Glenn asked if Giebel knew about the rating that was done to guarantee victory. According to Giebel, only the top students could finish the contests, and this arrangement happened every year. That meant it was okay for students to compete in more than one contest. Sistine disagreed and said there was no point if the competition was only for the smartest students, especially since Glenn had promised to make their class win, and that was why everyone's role was important. Sistine made sure Glenn agreed with her opinion, but Rumia noticed a different expression on Glenn's face as if he disagreed with Sistine. After that, Glenn felt discouraged because the other classes only selected their top students as participants. He had forgotten the competition rules since he had never joined before. On that day, the contestants were about to start training when suddenly Christ from the first-year class chased away the second-year students because the first years wanted to practice there. Cash was upset and argued back with him, and Glenn tried to intervene to stop the conflict. Not long after, Hallie, who was assigned as the instructor for the first-year class, arrived. Glenn greeted his senior by the name Harlem. Hallie looked annoyed because Glenn seemed to be mocking him. Glenn asked if the first-year class was training for the competition. Hallie confidently said that he would guide the first years and they would definitely win. Hearing this, Glenn encouraged him. Hallie then asked Glenn and his students to leave the place immediately, but Glenn suggested that Hallie just move closer to the tree instead. However, Hallie insisted that the second-year students leave the area. He also knew that Glenn was using all of his students for the competition. According to Hallie, using low-performing students as participants was nothing but a disturbance during practice. Glenn disagreed and claimed that all of his students were the best, and of course, they were aiming for victory. He even challenged Hallie to a bet. The prize was 3 months' salary for whoever's students won. Glenn actually panicked after saying this, but had to say it because Hallie had mocked him first. Hallie understood that research required big funding and was confident his class would win. He also said his students hoped he would accept the challenge, so he finally accepted it. Glenn admitted he was glad Hallie accepted the challenge, though deep down he was still unsure if he would win. Sistine stepped in between them and expressed her objection to Hallie dominating the training area. She even threatened to report him to the academy's head if he kept behaving like that. Hallie could not deny it. Sistine then encouraged Glenn by saying they would all compete fairly and earn victory. Hallie was forced to find another training spot and said that Glenn's class would regret challenging his. Sistine reassured her friends that they would not lose because Glenn fully believed in them. After that, Glenn worked hard to train his students for the competition. Rudia and Sistine kept watching over him, confident that their efforts would pay off. Glenn consistently taught his students well, even though he was hungry. He remained professional and dedicated. Rumia admitted that Glenn was truly an amazing teacher. Sistine said Glenn should be even more serious in his teaching, but Rumia knew Sistine was just joking and laughed at her annoyed face. That night, Rumia held her locket while recalling a past event when she was separated from her mother. She cried, hoping her mother did not hate her. Suddenly, a man came and covered her mouth. The man told her not to cry. At that moment, Rumia was scared and just wished she would not die. The man comforted her and said he was a friend. He asked Rumia to stop crying because there were still enemies left. While remembering that, Sistine approached and told her that dinner was ready. Rumia thanked her. Sistine asked about the item Rumia was holding, but Rumia did not want to tell her. Rumia then reminded them to stay enthusiastic because tomorrow was the magic competition and the queen would be coming. Sistine was about to say that tomorrow meant Rumia would meet her mother, but Rumia said that her parents were actually Sistine's parents. She then quickly went to the dining table. Sistine's father and mother were already waiting at the table. Leonard, Sistine's father, apologized that they could not attend tomorrow because of work, even though they really wanted to see their daughters compete. Sistine understood since they were busy. Rumia asked them not to force themselves. Leonard told his wife, Filiana, that he was touched by their 2 daughters who were so kind. He called them angels and even goddesses. Filiana immediately choked him for exaggerating. She apologized because the work tomorrow could not be postponed and promised that next time they would ask for time off. Rumia again asked them not to push themselves. Meanwhile, Queen Alicia was on her way to the Magic Academy. Eleanor noticed the happy expression on Queen Alicia's face. It turned out Alicia was glad because she had the chance to see her daughter, even if it was from a distance. Seeing the pendant, Eleanor suggested that Queen Alicia should exchange it for another one. That day, Alicia officially opened the magic competition at the academy. All the students and teachers cheered loudly. Hallie felt very confident that her class would definitely win in front of the queen. While everyone was clapping, Glenn was actually feeling hungry. At the same time, Rumia was disappointed to see Queen Alicia not wearing her pendant. The first competition held was a magic race. Class 2 took 3rd place, and Rod and Key were really excited, not expecting to rank that high. Rubia and Sistine were also very happy. Sistine even asked if Glenn had used some special method to teach them so well that they could get 3rd place. Glenn explained that in a long-distance race, pacing was more important than speed, and he just did a little magic counting for Rod and Kai. Hearing that, Cash encouraged Alf and Bix to keep following Glenn's advice. Suddenly, Christ told them not to get too cocky because it was just a bit of luck. Holly then said she hoped that moment would remain the happiest memory for Class 2. Cash didn't accept that insult and said it was all thanks to Glenn's tricks, and as long as Glenn was around, Class 2 would never lose to Class 1. Meanwhile, Glenn hoped they would stop arguing because it was just making things harder. Nearby Queen Alicia, Celica was laughing loudly, cheering for Class 2. Rick scolded Celica for being rude, and Eleanor also told her off because her laughter was disturbing Queen Alicia. The Queen understood since Celica was actually an old friend of hers. Queen Alicia asked if Glenn was really that amazing to make Celica so happy. Celica said Glenn was just an ordinary guy but always managed to do unexpected things. The next competition was a magic sniper contest, and Cecil from Class 2 got 4th place. Cecil was very happy because Glenn's advice had helped him a lot. Then in the quick magic solver contest, Wendy from Class 2 won 1st place. She admitted that her success was thanks to following Glenn's suggestions. At that moment, Glenn was still holding back his hunger and didn't expect his students to be better than he had thought. For now, Class 1 was still leading with the highest score, Class 5 was in 2nd place, and Class 2 was in 3rd. Glenn understood that his students had worked hard and he needed to keep encouraging them. The event host, announced that the next competition was a mental defense contest, then headed to the field where the competition took place. Rumia represented Class 2 in the mental defense competition. Suddenly, Jael from Class 5 asked Rumia to withdraw from the contest. Rumia thought Jael was worried about her, but she couldn't let down all her classmates who had worked so hard, especially since if she won, Class 2 could swap places with Class 5 in the rankings. Abel asked if Glenn was really sure about putting Rumia in danger since her strength was white magic. Glenn said Rumia's real strength was her mental toughness. The competition was hosted by Prince Zest Sion, the master of manipulation magic. The first round tested participants with a sleep sound spell. Zest cast a spell that could make others fall asleep, and the competitors quickly used their magic to block it. The contestant from Class 1 failed. Ars guessed that was just a trick to save energy because their opponent was Shine's defending champion, Jael. Zest was curious how long Rumia would last and even stuck out his tongue mockingly. The next round was Confusion Mind. The Class 8 contestant overheated and failed. Then came Charm Mind Magic, where the competitor would be manipulated by the flirtatious prince. Only 2 participants were left standing, Jael and Rumia. Hebel was surprised that Rumia could still hold on. Glenn explained that Mind Up was a spell to boost mental resilience, so the stronger the owner, the stronger its effect. This round was probably easy for Rumia, but Jael was strong too. Next came Mind Break Magic, which was the hardest and most dangerous because it could damage the mind and cause unconsciousness. Surprisingly, both Jael and Rumia still managed to hold on. Jael asked Rumia again to quit, but she refused to give up for the sake of all her friends. Zest then increased his strength, which made Rumia fall to her knees, but she was not ready to give up yet. Suddenly, Glenn told Rumia, who was in the 2nd year, to step back. Rumia insisted that she was still able to continue, but Glenn stopped her anyway. Sistine also said that if it was painful, Rumia didn't have to hold herself back. Glenn acknowledged that Rumia had tried her best, but her opponent was also strong and he apologized. Rumia said she felt happy to have fought alongside them. Meanwhile, Jael suddenly fainted while standing and Zest decided to declare Rumia the winner. Even though Rumia had to withdraw, she had managed to resist the mind break earlier. Everyone cheered loudly, and Rumia was overjoyed to have won the competition. At that moment, Queen Alicia felt grateful to see Rumia smiling and having good teachers and friends. Celica even offered to do whatever she could if Queen Alicia asked her to, but the queen declined, knowing that the fact she had neglected Rumia wouldn't change. She was already very satisfied that day just to see Rumia happy. Celica asked if it was enough to just watch from afar. Eleanor encouraged Queen Alicia to try being honest with herself, even if only for that day. Queen Alicia smiled as she watched Rumia enjoying her time with her friends. The Magic Tournament at the Magic Academy was still underway, and surprisingly, Glenn and Class 2 were not stopping their push for the rankings. At that time, Albert and Riel finally managed to find Glenn, who had left earlier without saying a single word to them. Riel intended to approach Glenn, but Albert stopped her. Riel admitted that she wanted to settle her matters with Glenn, and she asked if Albert did not want to see Glenn as well. Albert admitted that there were many things he wanted to ask Glenn, but their mission at the moment was more important. Their current task was to keep an eye on the Royal Guard unit that was protecting the Queen. Apparently, Albert had received news about suspicious activity among the Royal Guards, and there was a possibility that they were plotting something against the Queen. That was exactly what their commander feared. Riel still wanted to resolve her personal business with Glenn. It was still lunch break, and all the students were eating their packed lunches together. Meanwhile, Glenn was still starving and looked like he was about to eat Sherrod's twigs again. Suddenly, Lynn approached Glenn and asked if the competition she was going to join could be replaced with another participant. The event Lynn was supposed to join was the Transformation Magic Contest. She explained that she had been practicing the self-illusion spell as much as she could, but it was difficult for her to perform it properly. Glenn asked her about her own feelings. Did she not want to participate, especially since she liked transformation magic? Lynn admitted that she did enjoy it, saying that transforming was like having a chance to become someone else. Hearing that, Glenn encouraged her to just join the competition. However, Lynn felt that everyone was motivated to aim for victory with Glenn, and she was afraid of holding them back. Glenn explained that the event that day was more of a showcase match and part of the festival, so as long as they had fun, that was enough. Lynn was still unsure, so Glenn reviewed self-illusion with her and asked her what it meant. Lynn replied that it was a form of black magic wrapped in illusion. According to Glenn, self-illusion was not a grand incantation that reshaped the body into something else. He immediately demonstrated his illusion act, transforming himself into Rumia, and explained that all Lynn needed to do was visualize it clearly. In his view, her self-illusion was failing because her mental image was still too vague. Glenn then asked what she truly wanted to transform into. Lynn said she wanted to become the angel form of Goddess Latilica. Glenn told her to borrow a book about Goddess Latilica to strengthen her visualization and assured her that she would succeed because she was more talented than she realized. He also told her not to be afraid of failure, even promising to defend her if anyone blamed her later. Lynn laughed when she saw Rumia's face speaking in a man's manner. She understood and decided to try it. Not long after, Sistine came over, thinking that it was Rumia, and invited her to have lunch together since she had prepared a lunchbox for her. Glenn, who was still in disguise, could barely contain himself at the sight of food right in front of him. He thought to himself that deceiving his own student just to get food was wrong, but his hunger made it hard to resist. Sistine assumed Rumia was extremely hungry. Glenn quickly grabbed the lunchbox and was about to eat it when the real Rumia appeared. Sistine was shocked and instantly dispelled the disguise, revealing Glenn's true form. Upon realizing that it was Glenn tricking her just to steal a student's lunch, Sistine angrily blasted him away with her magic. She was frustrated, especially since she had woken up early to make that lunch. Glenn landed in the bushes of the school's back garden, stunned at how hard Sistine had thrown him. Still hungry, he sat on a bench, lamenting his life that had come to the point where he could only chew on sherrod twigs to fill his stomach. Before long, Ruby approached him, bringing him some food. Glenn was moved to see it, thanked her sincerely, and immediately devoured the sandwiches. The freshness of the tomatoes, the delicious meat, and the thinly sliced cheese blended into a perfect harmony in every bite. Glenn asked if Rumia had made them herself. Rumia admitted that she was rather clumsy and not very skilled at cooking, and that she had been asked to keep the identity of the actual cook a secret. She explained that the person who made it had woken up early to prepare the lunch, got into an argument, and decided not to give it away. Since it would have gone to waste, Rumia took it. Glenn said he was grateful to the girl who made it, adding that the man who rejected such a lunch was a fool. Feeling full, he thanked Rumia again for the delicious meal. Rumia was sure that the girl who made it would be happy to know. As they were about to head back, someone suddenly came up asking to speak with Glenn. He said he had no time to chat because he was busy, until he saw that the person was none other than Queen Alicia. Meanwhile, Zeros was asking his troops where Queen Alicia was. One of his men apologized for being careless, and Zeros ordered them to search for her. In truth, Celica had hidden the queen using her magic, allowing her to slip away without arousing the guard's suspicion. Eleanor approached Celica and told her something that left her shocked. At that moment, Glenn knelt before Queen Alicia. It had been a year since they last met, and the queen asked if he had been doing well. Queen Alicia apologized to Glenn for being forced out of the magic territory forces, even though he had served the country for so long. Glenn brushed it off, saying he had only quit because he was bored with the job. He told Queen Alicia not to lower her head to someone as worthless as him. Glenn was puzzled about why Queen Alicia came without any guards, but it turned out she had purposely come to see Rumia. Queen Alicia warmly greeted Rumia, asking how she was and how her life had been with the female family. She was deeply moved to meet her and called her by the name Ermiana. Rumia noticed the pendant Queen Alicia wore and realized it was different from her own. She apologized and said the queen must have mistaken her for someone else, admitting she was not the late Princess Ermiana El-Kel Alzano. Queen Alicia looked saddened, realizing Ermiana had died in the plague 3 years ago. She apologized for making Rumia uncomfortable. Rumia quickly left. At that moment, Queen Alicia understood that Rumia truly struggled to accept her, and in that moment didn't even see her as a mother. The queen then returned to the palace, but before leaving, she asked Glenn to take care of Rumia. When she arrived back at the palace, Zeros confronted her. He apologized but said he needed to secure her for the time being. The royal guards then detained Queen Alicia. Meanwhile, Albert used his magic to check on her situation and could hardly believe Zeros would do such a thing. Zeros was the commander of the royal guard. 40 years ago, during the Great War, he was rumored to have fought evenly with the master swordsman Johannes, and he was not the type to act recklessly. Hearing this, Riel was ready to go kill all their enemies, but Albert stopped her. He told her that the royal guards were the most loyal soldiers to Queen Alicia and he was sure they wouldn't harm her, believing they must have something else planned. Riel suggested attacking the enemy head-on. Meanwhile, the magic competition was still going on. Teresa from Class 2 had just completed the 50-kilogram lift, winning the weightlifting event. At that time, Glenn's thoughts wandered to a former princess who had been cast aside because of her special abilities. Suddenly, Sistine came up to him. Glenn was on guard, worried she might throw something at him again. But instead, Sistine asked about Rumia, who still hadn't come back. Glenn told her about Rumia and Queen Alicia meeting earlier that day. He said that anyone would probably want to be alone after going through something like that, but he planned to look for her. He asked Sistine to watch over their class while he searched. Glenn felt ready to spend the whole day looking for Rumia. He was already full after eating, thanks to the sandwich Rumia had given him. He even joked that it looked like the person who made it had meant to toss it in the trash. Sistine was shocked to hear that. She called it trash food that turned out useful, but Glenn firmly disagreed. Even though it looked plain, it was made with care and tasted amazing, so he told her not to call it trash. It was disrespectful to the person who made it. Sistine was actually a bit flustered by his words, but she quickly told him to just go already. Glenn eventually found Rumia sitting alone, staring at her pendant. Inside, there was nothing. She remembered there had once been a photo of someone precious in it, but it was gone now. Glenn asked if she still felt like the pendant held something valuable. Rumia knew Glenn was aware of the truth about her and Queen Alicia, so she asked what he thought she should do. She knew Queen Alicia had abandoned her because she was believed to be the embodiment of a demon. Ever since she was born with her special ability, she had been a threat to the royal family's status. For the sake of the country's future, she got to be exiled. Even so, Rumia still couldn't forgive Queen Alicia. She felt anger toward her, but she also longed to call her mother once more and hug her again. If she did that, though, she would feel like she was betraying Sistine's parents, who had raised her. She truly didn't know what she should do. Glenn told her that humans are creatures who always end up hurt and regret the choices they make. People often say to just choose in a way that won't bring regret, but that's impossible. No matter how hard the path, regret will always come. That's why what matters most is following your heart. If you choose with your heart, the pain will be smaller when the regret finally comes. He asked her what she would do. Rumia admitted she didn't even understand her own heart. Glenn then shared that he used to be a mage in the royal army and often attended court trials. There he had seen someone with the exact same pendant as hers, someone with the greatest influence in the room. He was certain that person could never throw it away because it was too precious. The answer had been there all along, Glenn said, so it was okay for her to keep her buried anger instead of running away from the problem. Glenn encouraged Rumia to face the situation with her heart, which moved her deeply. He admitted that he wasn't in the best position to say that since he had once run away himself. Rumia confessed that she felt terrified whenever she thought about Queen Alicia's cold gaze. She pleaded with Glenn to accompany her when she met the Queen, and he agreed, prompting her to thank him sincerely. Suddenly, several royal guards approached Rumia, pointing their swords at her. They declared that she had been accused of plotting to assassinate Queen Alicia the Eighth, adding that she would face the death penalty for treason and defaming the kingdom. Rumia was naturally shocked, while Glenn demanded they show proof of such accusations. The guards refused, saying they didn't owe an explanation to outsiders. Glenn questioned whether they planned to carry out an execution without a trial or a written order, but the guards claimed they were acting under the Queen's direct command. Determined to protect Rumia, Glenn stepped forward, but the guards warned that he too could be punished for treason. At that moment, Rumia dropped to her knees, agreeing to comply with their orders, believing she should atone for defying the Queen. She begged the guards to spare Glenn. Glenn was taken aback by her sudden surrender. One of the guards then struck him, knocking him unconscious. The guards took Rumia away and tied her to a tree, instructing her to stay still and close her eyes, warning that a mistake in their aim could cause her great suffering. Rumia obeyed. She understood that this was the day someone had been waiting for to remove her from the picture. It dawned on her that Queen Alicia's earlier meeting with her had been a final farewell. She thought about how she should have died 3 years ago, but had somehow lived on, creating so many beautiful memories. Tears streamed down her face as she recalled them. Just as a sword was about to strike, Glenn's voice called out, telling her to keep her eyes closed. He had returned using magic that blinded the guards with a burst of light. Acting swiftly, he incapacitated them all and untied Rumia. She asked what he had done, and he explained it was just a flashlight spell that only dazzled the eyes. She then asked why he had saved her, and he replied that if he had ignored her, Sistine would have been furious with him. Rumia urged him not to joke, pointing out that by doing this, he had gone against the kingdom. Glenn reassured her not to worry, saying that the Queen wouldn't have her eliminated without a trial, and that he was certain someone else was orchestrating this behind the scenes. Before long, more guards arrived to arrest them. Rumia panicked, but Glenn quickly cast a spell to help them escape. Carrying her in his arms, he sprinted across the school rooftops. Their problem now was figuring out how to bypass the guards and reach Queen Alicia. Glenn realized they might not need to meet her face to face. He contacted Celica and asked if she was with the Queen. To his surprise, Celica said she couldn't do anything to help, neither act nor speak about the situation. Glenn pressed her for information about the Queen's condition, but she couldn't tell him. He then asked why the guards had gone out of control and why the Queen had ordered Rumia's punishment. Celica told him that only he could resolve this matter, urging him to understand the meaning behind her words and to remember what happened when he met the Queen earlier. Glenn pieced together that Queen Alicia was likely surrounded by guards and her commander, Zelos. The realization left him troubled and unsure of what to do next. At that moment, Albert and Rial appeared. Without warning, Rial drew her sword and pointed it directly at Glenn. That day, Eleanor told Celica that the necklace Queen Alicia was wearing was actually a conditional curse necklace. Hearing this, Celica was shocked. It turned out the Royal Security Forces planned to sacrifice Queen Alicia's life for the so-called noble mission of the Celestial Goodwill Investigators. Zelos and Eleanor were secretly working together on that mission. Eleanor explained there was only one way to break the curse if they wanted to save Queen Alicia. Celica sincerely hoped Glenn would be able to do it. Meanwhile, Glenn was busy protecting Rumia from Rial's attacks. Rial demonstrated alchemy magic. She and Alf were part of the Royal Magical Court's special forces. Glenn unleashed his ice magic, but it seemed useless. Rial was preparing close-range alchemy attacks while Albert readied a long-range sniper shot. Glenn's position was locked down, making it impossible to dodge both attacks. But surprisingly, the bullet ended up hitting Rial instead, knocking her down. Moments later, Alf approached Glenn and greeted him, leaving Glenn stunned to see Albert there as well. After that, Glenn grabbed Rial's ear in frustration for nearly getting him killed. Rumia asked Glenn who they really were. He explained that Albert and Rial were old comrades from his time in the Royal Army, members of the Royal Magical Court's elite execution unit. Albert was known as Star No. 17, while Rial carried the title of War Chariot No. 7. Rial scolded Albert for casting military magic inside the city, though she had just done the same. Annoyed, Glenn pulled her ear again. Albert then told Glenn that the royal guards had been keeping a close watch on Queen Alicia, and it looked like they had taken it upon themselves to carry out a plan to remove the former princess. This shocked Rumia. Albert added that Celica was currently in the main hall, but seemed unable to make a move. Glenn was puzzled since Celica could normally take down 1 or 2 guards without trouble. He also didn't understand why the guards were suddenly targeting Rumia. Rial said there was no point in dwelling on the mystery, and that they should focus on finding a solution. Her suggestion was to attack head-on, Glenn from the front and Albert from the front as well. Glenn found the idea ridiculous and pulled her ear yet again, telling her to drop the habit of rushing in without thinking. Rumia commented that Glenn and Rial seemed pretty close, but Glenn denied it. Still, he was relieved they didn't have to fight against each other and asked for their help. Albert wanted to know what Glenn's plan was. Glenn said Celica had told him to find a way to meet Queen Alicia, and he was sure that was the key to solving everything. Albert questioned why he was so confident in Celica's words. Glenn explained that Celica, nicknamed The World, was a former executioner of Special Forces Unit No. 21 and one of the most famous and powerful mages across the 7 continents. She might be stingy and mean, but she never spoke nonsense. Glenn pleaded with Albert to trust her. At that time, the final events of the school competition were still underway. In the invention and unveiling contest, Class 1 was showing a strong lead. While Class 2's efforts to win crumbled, they had fallen to last place. Cash had suspected that without Glenn, things would be tough. Whitey wondered where Glenn had gone. Suddenly, Albert approached the Class 2 students, introducing himself and Rial as Glenn's friends. He explained that Glenn had urgent business he couldn't put off and had asked Albert to guide Class 2 and help them win the magic competition. Meanwhile, Glenn was running with Rumia in his arms, evading the royal guards. The Class 2 students were understandably awkward around the newcomers. Out of nowhere, Rial took Sistine's hand and urged the class to trust her and Albert. Sistine seemed to already know about them and asked them to help lead Class 2. Her friends were surprised at how quickly she trusted them. Sistine explained that no matter who was leading, everyone in Class 2 already knew what they needed to do: beat Class 1 together. Besides, if they lost while Glenn was away, he would probably call them pathetic. Just imagining that was enough to get Wendy and Giebel annoyed. Cash then encouraged everyone to believe they could win. Class 2 was in a slump, and if they lost the transformation contest, their hopes would be gone. Hallie remarked that without Glenn, Class 2 was just a bunch of ordinary students. He even told Christ to crush them. In the transformation contest, Seta from Class 1 transformed into an impressive dragon, earning 37 points. Lynn started feeling hopeless. Albert went up to her, telling her to stay calm and just do what she had practiced. He reminded her that the magic competition was part of the festival, and if anyone mocked her for failing, he'd personally deal with them using his steel fist. The way he said it reminded Lynn of Glenn, which helped her relax a little. When it was her turn, she began chanting her spell and visualizing the form she wanted. She successfully created the image of the angelic goddess Latilica, unexpectedly earning a perfect score of 40 points, surpassing Seta's score. Momentum swung back to Class 2. Next came the Granzia event, which Class 2 also won. This tied the total score at 195 points each with Class 1. The last event was the Magic Duel, and the winner of that duel would decide the overall champion. Meanwhile, Glenn managed to escape from the royal guards and kept running across the academy rooftops while carrying Rumia in his arms. At that moment, Zeros asked his subordinates why Rumia had not been captured yet. The guards explained that a magic instructor had helped her escape. This made Zeros angry, and he ordered the royal guards to find Rumia immediately and end her life. During that time, the Magic Duel tournament was still underway. Ebel's elemental magic successfully trapped Kreis. Kreis regretted his loss, and the second round went to Gebel, allowing him to even the score after Cash had lost in the first round. In the final round, Sistine would face Heinkel. Both were among the Academy's top students. Gebel told Sistine not to let his earlier efforts go to waste, as he had already heated up the competition. Albert encouraged them to win, promising that if they succeeded, he would treat them to anything they wanted. A message coming directly from Glenn. Albert was placing his hopes on Sistine's skills. At that same moment, Glenn was still running from the pursuing royal guards. As the duel began, Heinkel's firewall spell caused Sistine to hesitate. Hallie cheered for Heinkel, urging him to defeat Sistine, while Sistine's friends shouted words of encouragement to her. Sistine remembered what Albert had said and realized that Riel's words sounded familiar as well. It seemed she knew something about them. Sistine then unleashed her Storm Wall spell, trapping Heinkel inside of Swirling Tempest. Heinkel attempted to cast his lightning magic, but Sistine acted first, using Gale Blow to send him flying. Hallie could hardly believe what had just happened. In the end, Class 2 emerged as the winners of the magic tournament. All the students in Class 2 cheered in celebration of their victory. Meanwhile, Glenn and Rumia found themselves surrounded by the royal guards. As the award ceremony was about to begin, Ars invited Class 2's representatives to receive their medals from Queen Alicia. Ars was shocked to see Albert and Rial approaching the Queen, and Celica was equally surprised that they were appearing before her. Albert explained that he and Rial were the instructor representatives of the winning class and would be receiving the medals directly from Queen Alicia. However, to everyone's astonishment, Albert and Rial suddenly transformed into Glenn and Rumia. Zeros could hardly believe it, since Glenn and Rumia were supposed to be under pursuit by the royal guards. It turned out that Glenn and Rumia had switched places with Albert and Rial by using self-illusion magic. Sistine realized that her suspicion had been correct. Rial was actually Rumia. Zeros quickly ordered the royal guards to capture Glenn and Rumia, but Celica immediately cast a separation barrier to protect them. Glenn informed Queen Alicia that Zeros and the royal guards had been acting under her name in an attempt to kill Rumia, but he had managed to save her. He asked the Queen to order an end to this unreasonable violence. Zeros refused, saying that once everything was over, he would take full responsibility, even at the cost of his own life. However, only the Queen would bear the burden of the nation, which had to be protected at all costs. He also said that Queen Alicia had already sacrificed so much to protect her own life, and he urged her to give the order for the sake of everyone. Queen Alicia then commanded that Rumia be punished, saying she could not allow her to remain alive. She went so far as to say that she wished Rumia had never existed, admitting she had never loved her and had always regretted giving birth to her. Hearing this, Glenn was shocked and wondered why Queen Alicia was lying. Rumia's strength seemed to leave her as she tried to confirm whether those were truly the Queen's feelings. Zeros readied his twin swords. Glenn, now panicking, asked Celica what was really happening, but she stayed silent. Glenn could not understand the situation. He had thought everything would be resolved once they met the Queen. He recalled this sadness in Queen Alicia's words when she spoke of losing Rumia, and it puzzled him. If the Queen had truly wanted Rumia dead, she could have simply given the order long ago. Glenn was convinced there had to be a reason why she could not speak the truth. He remembered Celica asking him to solve this matter. Suddenly, Glenn complimented the Queen's necklace and asked her to remove it, but she was unable to do so. At that moment, Glenn understood. He told Rumia that Queen Alicia did, in fact, love her. Glenn quickly ran toward Queen Alicia, but Zeros blocked his way with a sword, injuring his arm. Just as Zeros was about to stab him, Rumia shouted loudly and Queen Alicia threw her necklace. Seizing the moment, Glenn kicked Zeros hard. The necklace shattered, revealing it was a conditional curse. If the wearer removed it, they would die. If the time ran out, they would die. If they revealed how to remove it, they would die. And the only way to break it was to kill Rumia. Celica immediately wrapped Glenn's wound with a bandage and told him she trusted him completely. Zeros was confused as to why the curse hadn't worked, and Glenn revealed the Fool's Arcana card he had used to seal all magic within a certain range. Glenn asked Queen Alicia to stop hiding the truth. Rumia realized that if the Queen had accidentally spoken, she would have been killed. Piecing it all together, Glenn understood there had to be a cursed object involved. He then hugged Rumia and apologized for hurting her again, expressing how grateful he was that she was safe. Hearing this, Rumia's tears flowed uncontrollably, and she called Queen Alicia mother. The royal guards were relieved that the queen had finally been saved. Meanwhile, Albert confronted Eleanor and explained that his mission was to keep an eye on certain royal guards who had recently been acting suspiciously, and to investigate the background of those close to Queen Alicia. He recognized Eleanor as a heretical witch from the Sky Salvation Bureau and asked why she wanted to kill Rumia. Eleanor admitted not all royal soldiers were fools, that mentioned the Akashic records, claiming that was the only purpose of Princess Rumia. When Eleanor tried to escape, Rial attacked her, but unfortunately, Eleanor managed to teleport away. Frustrated, Albert immediately informed Glenn that the mastermind behind everything was Eleanor, the Queen's headmaid, meaning the Sky Salvation Bureau had infiltrated the kingdom deeply. Albert and Rial decided to return to plan a countermeasure and told Glenn to be careful. Glenn thanked them, though Rial still gave him a stern warning. Not long after, Rumia approached Glenn and smiled at him. At that moment, Queen Alicia was about to take her leave. She asked Celica to look after Rumia, making sure she stayed healthy and happy. That night, Glenn and Rumia walked together. Rumia said she felt relieved after talking about so many things with her mother, and it was all thanks to Glenn. Glenn insisted he hadn't done much. Rumia then asked how he knew her mother had been lying. Glenn explained that 3 years ago, when Rumia was kidnapped, Queen Alicia had asked for his help to save her daughter, and he had seen her cry back then. Rumia understood, realizing that's why Glenn still remembered the promise he made 3 years ago to protect her. Glenn took that promise seriously. Rumia felt grateful for being saved by both Glenn and her mother. Glenn mentioned that the second-year students had also worked hard, and it was time to reward them. They had gathered in a cafe where Sistine even looked tipsy from eating too much brandy cake. Sistine hugged Glenn and said she was impressed he had saved Rumia again. Glenn felt a bit awkward since her face was way too close to his. A moment later, the cafe owner arrived with the bill for all the second-year students' food, totaling 1 million yen. Glenn was stunned, realizing his prize money and 3 months' salary had vanished in an instant. In mock frustration, he considered punishing them with his extinction ray magic. That early morning, Glenn took Sistine outside for training, and she was already feeling exhausted. She asked if her skills had gotten any better. Glenn told her that compared to when they first started, she had definitely improved. He tossed his jacket to her so she wouldn't get cold, and she quickly put it on. Wearing it made her blush, and she couldn't help but notice the faint scent of Glenn on it. Glenn suggested they work on striking practice, but Sistine asked why they had to train in hand-to-hand combat. Glenn had already guessed she would ask that question. After they were done, Sistine admitted she had thought this special training would be about enhancing magic power or practicing stone spells. Glenn explained that unarmed combat could sharpen her senses for both offense and defense during magical duels. Sistine wondered if Glenn was just venting his frustration because she often scolded him. Glenn admitted that was part of it, but their main focus now was to get her good at hand-to-hand fighting. Once she mastered that, he promised to teach her military-grade magic. Glenn believed she would need that kind of magic if the time ever came for her to protect Rumia. He told her not to worry. If she was afraid of military magic, he wouldn't push her toward the dark side of magic, because he trusted she could use her power the right way. As daylight broke, Sistine earnestly asked for Glenn's guidance and encouragement. Later at school, Sistine and Rumia approached Glenn, who was sitting alone looking deep in thought. Rumia asked if he hadn't slept enough since he looked so pale. Sistine guessed it was because Glenn worried about Rumia so much that he waited for her there every day. Glenn denied it, saying it was just coincidence they took the same route at the same time. Suddenly, Rial showed up and drew her sword at Glenn, saying she had missed him. Glenn blocked her attack and demanded to know why she suddenly went after him, asking if she was trying to kill him. Rial explained she was just following Albert's advice, who told her to greet a fellow comrade like that. Glenn wondered if Albert secretly disliked him. Sistine remembered seeing Rial at the magic competition before. They asked if she was the transfer student since she was wearing a school uniform. It turned out the royal government had decided to send an official guard for Rumia, and their plan was to disguise a mage as a transfer student. Glenn was surprised that the chosen person was Rial. Rumia felt reassured knowing Rial was there for her, but unexpectedly, Rial said she was actually there to protect Glenn instead. Glenn reminded her that her job was to protect Rumia, but Rial seemed more interested in guarding him. Annoyed by her nonsense, Glenn grabbed her ear and made it clear she had to keep her identity and mission a secret, even shaking her a little so she would understand. That day, Glenn introduced Rial to the class as the new transfer student. The boys were clearly thrilled to see how cute she was. Glenn asked everyone to be friends with her. When it was her turn to introduce herself, Rial simply stated her name. Glenn encouraged her to share more about herself, like hobbies or anything else, but she instead revealed that she was a soldier in the Royal Army and part of the Special Forces of the Court Mage Division. Hearing that, Glenn immediately covered her mouth and whispered for her to just say she was from Eteria, dreamed of joining the Royal Army, and came to the academy to study magic. The boys whispered among themselves that she was a bit strange but still cute. Wendy then asked if Rial came without her family. Glenn quickly told them not to ask about her family, explaining that she was an orphan, which made Wendy apologize. Soon after, Cash asked what Glenn's relationship with Rial was since they seemed to know each other. Rial declared that Glenn meant everything to her and that she had decided to live only for him. The girls in class cheered at her boldness, while the boys felt rejected. Glenn panicked at her statement, while Sistine's face showed a hint of disappointment. That day, the second-year students were being graded on using the Shock Bolt spell to destroy golems. Sistine successfully destroyed all 6 targets in a single strike. The other students were impressed, and Rumia praised her for how much she had improved lately. Glenn called her amazing, making her blush and reply that it was nothing unusual. Next, it was Rial's turn. The students were curious about her abilities, especially since she had said she wanted to join the Royal Army, but her Shock Bolt attacks kept missing. Glenn realized he had never actually seen her use Shock Bolt before and began to doubt whether she really was from the Royal Army. She had only one attempt left and asked if she could use something other than Shock Bolt. Glenn said he wouldn't stop her, though normally that was the only spell used from that distance. Rial then summoned her massive sword. Glenn tried to stop her, but she dashed forward and smashed all 6 targets instantly. The students were stunned and a little scared. During the lunch break, no one approached her, and Glenn guessed the others already saw her as dangerous. When he asked about her lunch, Rial said she didn't need any because she could go without food for 3 days. Rumia reminded her that it was important to eat and invited her to the cafeteria. Rial still wasn't used to crowded places, but she was drawn to the smell of food there. Rumia invited her to order something, and when she noticed Rial staring at a strawberry tart, she ordered plenty for her. Rial ate enthusiastically, enjoying every bite. Rumia mentioned that Sistine also likes strawberry tarts, so Rial offered her some, but Sistine told her to eat it all herself. Noticing cream all over Rial's face, Sistine gently wiped it off and Rial thanked her. Some of the other students came over. Wendy asked since when the 3 of them had gotten so close. Seeing Rial eating so eagerly, Cash admitted it was hard to believe she was the same person who had swung her sword earlier to destroy the golem. Rial kept eating quickly, so Wendy assured her no one was going to take her food. Sistine then reminded her to eat more calmly. From a distance, Glenn watched the scene, relieved that Rial was making friends. Later, Glenn met with Celica and asked what the military was thinking when they sent Rial to watch over Rumia. Celica described Rial as a unique girl. Glenn said she was learning how to get along with others and added that he hoped she would pick up something valuable during the upcoming school trip. Celica teased him, saying he was starting to sound more and more like a real teacher. When it was time for the trip, the boys didn't seem too excited at first. Glenn told them they were actually lucky and asked where the alchemy research lab was located. Cash explained it was on the famous beaches of Cineria Island. Glenn pointed out that Cineria Beach was always warm enough for swimming and mentioned that the girls in their class were all impressive. That thought instantly changed the boys' mood, making them eager for the trip. Sistine, seeing their reactions, remarked that their teacher was hopeless and the boys were just as silly. When they arrived, some of the girls stopped to look at a stall selling rare items. Glenn stepped in and told the shopkeeper not to offer strange trinkets to his students. The man then revealed a rare artifact from the Alzano royal family. Glenn quickly realized the seller was actually Albert in disguise. Albert took off his cover and warned Glenn to be careful with Rial, saying she could be dangerous. Glenn brushed it off as a joke. Albert reminded him that Glenn should already know this, but accused him of being his name as always. At that time, Rial was walking around with Sistine and Rumia, enjoying the view. Sistine marveled at the scenery of Cineria Island, but Glenn didn't seem to be doing well, needing help from Rumia and Rial to walk. Sistine suggested that if he got seasick, he should have chosen another destination, like the Canterley Military Magic Research Lab. Glenn, however, insisted that beautiful women in swimsuits were his top priority. He would choose such a location even if it were in a war zone. The boys cheered at the thought. Rumia asked if Glenn had picked the destination to keep them away from military magic, but Glenn admitted he simply wanted to see the girls in swimsuits. Later that afternoon, the girls wore their swimsuits and played on the beach. The boys were moved by this sight and thanked Glenn profusely. He gave them free time until the evening to enjoy themselves. Abel, unlike the others, chose to sit under a tree and read, saying he hadn't come there to play. Rumia, Sistine, and Rial walked over to Glenn. Rubia asked what he thought of their appearance, and Glenn said they looked adorable, even complimenting Sistine's great sense of style. Sistine blushed and told him not to look at her like that. Then Rial suddenly came closer and Glenn asked why they weren't out playing on the beach. Rumia invited him to join them for a volleyball game. At first, Glenn refused, saying he didn't want to get tanned, but in the end he joined. They ended up having a blast playing volleyball with magic spells mixed in. That night, a group of boys planned to sneak toward the girls' rooms, with Cash even preparing a map to mark the best route. One of them asked about Glenn, and Cash explained he had timed it so Glenn's patrol would take him far from the target area in about 30 minutes. They were feeling confident about their plan until Glenn suddenly appeared behind them. Shocked, Cash asked how he could possibly be there. Glenn told them that if he were a student, he would probably be thinking the same thing they were, but rules were rules, and they needed to head back to their rooms. The boys activated magic, saying they weren't the type to give up easily. Glenn told them to cut it out, but instead they banded together to try and beat him. Sistine, Rumia, and Rial watched from a distance. Sistine and Rumia called all the boys foolish, while Rial admitted this was the first time she had ever seen Glenn looking so cheerful. Sistine replied that this was just how Glenn always was at school. Rial recalled how Glenn had always seemed gloomy in the past, which made her feel the need to stay close to him and protect him. Not long after, Wendy invited everyone to join a card game, including Rial. Even though Rial admitted she didn't really understand how to play, she still wanted to participate. Seeing this, Rumia commented that it seemed like Rial was starting to get used to socializing with others. Glenn managed to defeat the male students, surprised to find out that they were actually taking the game quite seriously. That night, Glenn stood gazing out over the vast ocean when Rumia, Sistine, and Rial came to join him, wanting to admire the night sky together. Sistine asked Rial if she found it boring, but Rial admitted that while she didn't fully understand it, she never got tired of that view. Rubia felt grateful to have met Rial, though she couldn't explain exactly why. She cherished their friendship and considered it something precious. At that moment, Rumia invited them to play in the water and have fun. Rial might not have fully understood the meaning of friendship, but she enjoyed the feeling. Watching the three of them laugh and play together made Glenn question why Albert had once warned him to be careful around Rial, since she seemed to be just an ordinary girl. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Rial quietly left her room and headed toward the beach. Glenn happened to cross paths with her and asked why she was out so late. Rial said she wanted to see him. Glenn told her to go back to the inn, but she then asked why he had left. Hearing that, Glenn apologized for suddenly leaving the Royal Mage Corps. Rial admitted that without Glenn by her side, she didn't know who she was supposed to live for anymore. Glenn told her that wasn't true, pointing out that earlier that day he had seen her happy while spending time with Sistine, Rumia, and the others. But Rial still said she didn't quite understand those feelings. Glenn urged her to remain a student at the Magic Academy and to quit the Royal Mage Corps. Rial refused, insisting she wanted to live only for Glenn. He firmly told her to find her own happiness, saying that was what her older brother would have wanted for her. Frustrated, Rial said she didn't understand what Glenn meant and didn't see anything wrong with her desire. When Glenn tried to calm her down, she became upset and asked why it was wrong for her to fight to protect him, and why he didn't want to stay by her side. Rial resented the idea that Sistine and Rumia might have taken Glenn away from her, blaming and resenting them for it. Meanwhile, that same night, Eleanor met with someone to discuss their next plan to end Rumia's life. That day, the second-year students were walking toward the research lab. The trip was quite a distance, leaving them tired. Sistine couldn't help worrying about Rumia and Rial, though unfortunately, Rial didn't pay her any attention. Rumia assured her that Rial was fine. Sistine explained that she had panicked that morning when she didn't see Rial in their room. She asked her not to do that again and even remarked that if Rial kept acting that way, she would end up like Glenn. Rial was startled, tripped, and fell. Rumia and Sistine rushed to her side, but when Rumia tried to help, Rial grabbed her hand and told her not to touch her. Sistine was confused. Rumia had been worried about her, but Rial reacted so coldly. Rial, visibly upset, told them to stop caring about her and admitted that she disliked all of them. She quickly walked away, leaving Rumia and Sistine behind. Sistine didn't understand why she was acting like that, while Rumia wondered if maybe Riel didn't like them spending time together. Suddenly, Glenn spoke up, saying Rumia's guess wasn't right. According to him, Riel was a bit anxious because of something he had said to her the previous night that upset her. When the second-year students finally arrived at the alchemy research lab, they were welcomed by its head, Burks, who specialized in white alchemy. Glenn shook his hand and thanked him for helping with their field research. While the students were relaxing, Riel was sitting alone. Sistine noticed, but Rumia suggested they let her be. Burks began leading the students on a tour, explaining that white alchemy was a field combining white magic and alchemy, focused on the study of life itself. The place was filled with fresh mana, and the location was vital for their work. Rumia seemed startled when Burks glanced at her. The lab specialized in combining different plants and animals to create chimeras, leaving the students impressed. Sistine commented that she still wanted to become a magical archaeologist in the future, though she was starting to have doubts, while Rumia wanted to join the magical bureaucracy. Rumia felt uneasy seeing the experiments and questioned whether it was really okay to manipulate the lives of other creatures. Sistine realized that studying too deeply could lead someone down the wrong path into becoming a dark magician. However, this kind of research wasn't unique to this lab. She had heard that the kingdom once ran a major project to revive or awaken the dead. Burks was surprised to hear such a statement from a student like Sistine. She quickly clarified that according to her studies, reviving or awakening the dead was theoretically impossible. Burks agreed, saying no magic had ever proven otherwise, and was about to explain further when Glenn interrupted. Glenn explained that the revival project tried to create a body through alchemy using a person's genetic code, memories converted into data, and an astral code to recreate or restart a soul, something called alter either. These three elements would then be combined to bring someone back. Sistine thanked Glenn for the explanation but asked why he cut in. Glenn apologized, saying he was simply curious about the topic. Burks added that, in other words, the process was essentially making a duplicate of a person. Rumia questioned whether that could really be considered reviving someone. Burks admitted the term wasn't quite right. It was more like duplicating someone who already existed. Glenn said the research center for that project had been abandoned long ago as too many lives had been lost just to bring one person back, which was unforgivable. Burks agreed, adding that they were humans, not gods, and should never decide who lived or died. Reviving the dead was research that should stay banned. However, there were rumors that a group of Heaven's Charity researchers had stolen the research and successfully completed it. Glenn hoped it was only a rumor. Curious, Sistine asked if there was anything else needed for such a project besides the three elements mentioned earlier. Burks replied that it might require pure magic, meaning a person with that rare gift would be necessary. Sistine pointed out that the chances of someone having pure magic were extremely low. Burks chuckled, saying that regardless, for the project to succeed, something extraordinary would be needed to make it possible. After finishing the tour, the students had lunch. Sistine invited Rumia to eat with her at a restaurant in town, but Rumia looked troubled, still glancing at Riel sitting by herself. Sistine went over to invite Riel to join them, but she refused and quickly walked away. Seeing this, Glenn told Riel to stop sulking. Riel became upset and ran off, going as far as she could. She kept blaming Rumia and Sistine for taking Glenn away from her. She ran until she reached the beach, where she broke down crying, wondering how everything had ended up this way. Meanwhile, Glenn informed Rumia and Sistine that even though Riel looked to be around their age, her heart was like that of a child and had been that way since she was little. Because of this, Glenn hoped they would remain patient with her, even though it might be difficult. However, Rumia did not mind at all and said she would never hate Riel for that. Sistine was also willing to go look for Riel, but Glenn smiled and refused, saying it would be better if Rumia and Sistine just waited for Riel to come back because Glenn himself, as her teacher, would be the one to search for her. At the same time, Riel's older brother approached her on the beach and asked if she was crying. He also wondered if she had forgotten him. Riel was shocked to see her brother, whose name was Rainer. Rainer said he missed her very much, and hearing that, Riel's eyes filled with tears. Albert was observing them with his keen eyesight. When Albert tried to step closer, he was suddenly stopped by a protective spell. Albert realized that Eleanor must have acted quickly, or perhaps he himself was careless. Then Eleanor appeared, surprising Albert. She began teasing Albert, but unfortunately, Albert had no interest in a lowly woman like Eleanor. He immediately attacked her with magic power. Eleanor dodged and called Albert a cold man. Albert knew that Eleanor still had evil plans for the princess, but he was determined to stop her because he wanted to eliminate Eleanor. Eleanor accused Albert of being impatient, and the two clashed, using their magical powers against each other. The fire from their battle burned the plants around them. Not long after, Eleanor cast a spell to summon the spirits of the night. Soon, spirits appeared and started attacking Albert. Albert quickly cast lightning magic, destroying the spirits one by one. Albert was a sharpshooter but was unbeatable in close-range magic fights. Eleanor finally admitted that Albert was much stronger and more powerful than she expected, and she couldn't hold out any longer. Albert explained that her strong healing ability was neither a conditional healing spell nor the result of a recovery-boosting drug. To him, it was something disgusting. Before long, Eleanor had fully recovered from the attack. Albert realized that Eleanor was different from all the evil witches he had defeated before. If he managed to defeat her, the kingdom would gain an advantage regarding her organization. But Albert also knew that Eleanor was a dangerous woman and he had to finish her off immediately. Meanwhile, back at the inn, Rumia asked Sistine what was wrong with Rial. Sistine still didn't understand the reason. She recalled when the three of them were at the beach, and Rial said that she didn't really understand friendship but liked them. Sistine believed that Rial's words were sincere. Sistine decided to go shopping because she knew Glenn and Rial would be hungry when they returned. Rumia smiled and let Sistine go. At that moment, Rial still couldn't believe that Raynor had returned, even though he was supposed to be dead. She questioned him about it. Raynor admitted that he was indeed killed by the organization, but maybe Rial had been so angry that she didn't realize he was still alive. Raynor knew that for 2 years, Rial had recovered and gained her freedom. He asked Rial to save him because he was still a slave. Rial asked how she would help rescue him. Raynor explained that the organization needed Rumia to continue their plan, and Glenn was considered an obstacle. The organization gave Raynor a chance. If the plan succeeded, he could be free. Rial looked confused. Raynor asked if she would protect him or abandon him again. Soon after, Glenn arrived and quickly separated Raynor from Rial. Glenn already knew that Raynor was a researcher of the celestial virtue. Glenn didn't know what lies Raynor had told Rial and called Raynor an evil sorcerer. Glenn said it was useless for Raynor to attack because Glenn had prepared a foolproof arcana. Unexpectedly, Rial stabbed Glenn in the back with her dagger. Glenn was truly surprised by her betrayal. Rial said goodbye to Glenn and declared that she was living for her older brother. Meanwhile, Albert was still fighting Eleanor. Using his long-range vision, he noticed Glenn lying down, apparently killed by Rial. Albert realized Eleanor was only a distraction to buy time. After that, Eleanor left. At the same time, Sistine returned to the inn and was shocked to find Rumia lying unconscious, stabbed by Rial. Sistine was upset and asked what Rial had done to Rumia. Rial said Rumia was only unconscious. Sistine asked where Glenn was since he had gone to find Rial. Rial said she had already killed Glenn. Hearing this, Sistine was shocked and suspected that Rial was lying. Sistine couldn't understand why all this was happening. Rial confessed that she had actually joined the celestial virtue researchers and that, no matter what, she was Sistine's enemy. She also intended to take Rumia away. Sistine tried to stop her and threatened to shoot Rial if she didn't stay away from Rumia. Rial questioned whether Sistine could really do it and asked Sistine to shoot her, promising she wouldn't resist. Unfortunately, Sistine hesitated. She remembered words that said she was actually weak and just hiding behind a mask. She also recalled Rumia's desire to make magic useful for humanity, as well as Glenn's advice to use her power when military magic scared her. In the end, Sistine couldn't do anything, and Rial took Rumia away. At that moment, Sistine realized that if she used her power, Rumia could have been hit by the attack or Rial could have been killed. She understood that she was just afraid and powerless to act. Not long after, Albert arrived carrying Glenn's body and gently laid him down on the bed. Sistine was shocked and immediately rushed to Glenn's side. Albert told her not to worry because Glenn was still breathing. Sistine asked Albert to use healing magic, but it turned out to be useless since Glenn was already caught in the grasp of the god of death. Sistine broke down in tears, unable to accept what was happening. Albert then asked Sistine to lend him her power. Sistine cried harder, feeling lost and unsure of what to do, especially since healing magic couldn't help. She kept weeping, wondering why all of this was happening. Albert urged her to calm down and asked if all she could do was just mourn and cry, because if that was the case, it was as if she wanted to kill Glenn. Albert was about to leave and Sistine asked what she could do for Glenn. Albert explained that to heal him they needed to use the white magic called Reviver, but Sistine knew that spell required a huge amount of mana. Albert was aware of this too, which was why he needed Sistine's mana. Sistine agreed and Albert started preparing the ritual, asking Sistine to make a temporary magic contract with him. Suddenly, Albert announced that Glenn's breath had completely stopped. Hearing this, Sistine felt devastated. However, after checking Glenn's pulse, Albert said it was still beating. He then asked Sistine to give Glenn artificial respiration until the ritual was ready. Sistine looked nervous, but Albert was confident she could do it. Albert began the ritual preparations using his own blood. Sistine admitted she had never done artificial respiration before, but Albert told her there was no time to be afraid and to just do it. Sistine leaned her face close to Glenn's, her cheeks flushing as if she was about to kiss his lips. She continued giving him breaths until Albert finished the ritual setup. Meanwhile, Rumia was hanging but had already regained consciousness. Not long after, Rainer apologized for treating Rumia poorly, but said he really needed her, and everything he was doing was for himself and his younger sister, Rial. Rumia was shocked to see Rial and asked where Glenn was since she had been looking for him. Rainer said Glenn would not come because Rial had already killed him. Rumia couldn't believe it, knowing that Rial wouldn't do such a thing. Rial then apologized. Rial apologized to Rumia for having killed Glenn. Rumia was surprised and asked why Rial did such a thing. Rial didn't want to do it, but if she didn't know who she would live for. At that moment, Glenn was having a nightmare and suddenly woke up. Albert then said that Glenn was tough as usual. Glenn apologized for causing trouble for Albert. Albert told Glenn to thank Sistine because without her, the revival ritual wouldn't have been possible. Albert also just found out that Sistine actually had an impressive number of revivals. Glenn had already suspected that Sistine was really amazing, even if she was sometimes a bit rude. Albert mentioned that maybe they could rely on her to save the princess. Glenn asked Albert to explain the situation. After Albert explained everything, Glenn couldn't believe Rial could go that far. Albert was puzzled since he had warned Glenn to be careful around Rial beforehand. Glenn asked if Albert had suspected that the Sky Virtue researchers were planning something. Albert said there were suspicious reports around the White Alchemy Lab about some shady funding, and after investigating, they found a clear connection between them and Burks, the director. Glenn was surprised that Albert didn't tell him this when they met. He realized Albert had intentionally been using Rumia as bait. Glenn got angry and asked what Albert's superior's real intentions were and why Albert didn't stop it. Albert said Glenn should probably already know that. Glenn understood that if that was true, then Rial's identity might be exposed. He said he wouldn't forgive it if Rumia was really used as bait, and he didn't want Albert to involve Rumia just for their own interests. Albert acknowledged that his orders were cruel, and he admitted that by staying silent and following along, he was also cruel. But from that moment on, he wouldn't stop, and if Rial tried to get in his way, he would remove her. Glenn disagreed because their plan was to fix Rial first and then bring her back, and it was his responsibility since he had chosen her. Albert doubted that Rial would listen to Glenn, especially since her older brother had just appeared. Glenn was confident that he could do it, and even if he had to fight, he would make Rumia listen. Albert was shocked to hear that from Glenn, especially since Glenn had run away from his comrades without a word before, and Albert believed Rial's betrayal was because of that. Albert doubted whether he deserved to save Rial. Glenn got upset and said that he was a teacher and Rial was also his student. Albert had suspected that Glenn never really changed, and that's why he placed his hopes on him. Albert hit Glenn as a sign that he forgave him for disappearing without a word. Albert handed Glenn a pistol and said he would focus on saving Rumia, and if necessary, he would shoot Rial. Glenn gently stroked Sistine's head and thanked her for saving him once again. Albert and Glenn quickly left, but Cash and Cecil saw them from the balcony. Sistine woke up and cried, feeling guilty for failing to save Rumia. At that time, Rumia was tied up and was going to be used as a component for research to bring the dead back to life. Burks was pleased because with Rumia, he was confident the resurrection project would be completed that day. Burks praised Rainer for not only gathering 3 components but also defeating the enemy and acquiring the girl who could boost their power. Rumia was important for the resurrection project because the researchers didn't have pure magic. Burks asked Rumia to consider herself part of the research project. He told her that she might think the Sky Virtue researchers were evil, but the royal family was far worse and corrupt, and a kingdom ruled by such a family deserved to be overthrown. Eleanor interrupted Burks and told him to say more. Rumia asked what they really knew. At that moment, Rumia felt tormented as Burks activated his research device. Rial looked guilty and Rainer approached her, asking if she was okay. Eleanor suddenly realized something. Meanwhile, Glenn and Albert managed to find the place where Rumia was probably being held captive. Albert discovered the location by tracking a magic signal. Not the one on Rumia's body, since that spell had been erased. Albert had secretly placed another spell on Eleanor's body. Rumia placed great hope on Glenn to save her. Burks watched Glenn and Albert as they walked toward the place and didn't want them to interfere. He sent his created creature to stop them. Glenn and Albert kept walking through the corridor, wondering why there was no guard. Suddenly, they were surprised by the arrival of a fire lion. Albert quickly destroyed it with his magic. The fire lion disappeared. Burks was shocked by this. Eleanor smiled and said they were not so easily defeated by something like a fire lion. Meanwhile, Sistine, who had woken up, prepared to leave. She wondered why she felt useless despite training specially with Glenn. Suddenly, Wendy and Lynn entered Sistine's inn. They had suspected something was wrong and asked about Rumia's whereabouts. Glenn and Albert were still walking down the corridor. Albert explained that the fire line had once been studied by the military but was too dangerous and should have been discarded. Glenn mentioned that Burks was actually more cunning than they had thought. As Glenn suspected, there was definitely another creature intercepting them. The beast looked like a giant turtle. Burks laughed with satisfaction when he saw Glenn and Albert looking miserable in front of the beast. Meanwhile, Rumia felt sad and worried about Glenn. Burks proudly showed off his power in front of Eleanor, but Eleanor wasn't convinced because she knew that both Glenn and Albert could definitely defeat him. Together, Glenn and Albert combined their magic to destroy the beast. Sure enough, they easily eliminated the wild creature. Seeing this, Burks could hardly believe it. Eleanor laughed and said that Glenn really was impressive. Burks grew curious about who Glenn really was, since all he knew was that Glenn was just an ordinary magic instructor. Burks wanted to stop them, but from then on, Eleanor handed everything over to Rial because she didn't want to die there. Meanwhile, Sistine explained everything that was happening to her friends, assuring them that Glenn would surely do something. Cash was worried that Rumia and Rial might not come back. Kai suggested they go look for them, but Teresa said it would be too dangerous, especially since they would be searching without a clear plan. Wendy admitted that Glenn could be reckless sometimes, but when there was a problem, he was reliable. Cash even asked if they could still trust Glenn for something like that. Back to Glenn and Albert. They kept moving forward, and after passing a crossroads, they faced Burks again. Burks transformed into a terrifying creature. Albert told Glenn to run while he took care of Burks, and Glenn obeyed. Albert attacked Burks with his lightning spear and managed to hit his eye. At that moment, the students were about to decide to leave, but suddenly Giebel suggested they just let it be since Glenn had left without any message. Cash asked Giebel if he wasn't worried at all. Sistine understood that Giebel wanted them to trust Glenn. Like the others, Sistine also felt worried and scared, but she asked what they would do if they went out looking for Glenn. Cash said they had to help him. Sistine disagreed because they might just become a burden to Glenn. That's why she asked everyone to trust Glenn and wait for him. Sistine even begged them all to believe in Glenn. Cecil said that Glenn must be fine since he was a great person who once defeated terrorists all by himself. Sistine couldn't hold back her tears anymore. At that time, the research was almost finished, with Rial and Raynor waiting for the process. Raynor encouraged Rial to defeat Glenn and Albert for his own sake. Not long after, Glenn arrived and Rumia felt a bit relieved. Glenn apologized to Rumia for being late. Rumia was grateful that Glenn was safe. Glenn then asked Rial to say something after he had been harsh toward Rumia. Glenn scolded Raynor for making his student pose in such a provocative way. Raynor said it was Burke's doing. Glenn tried to attack Raynor, but Rial stopped him from getting close to her older brother. Raynor asked Rial not to let Glenn stop him. Rumia immediately activated her magic. Glenn didn't expect that Rial wanted to fight him. Rial confessed she would fight for Raynor. Glenn tried to make Rial realize she was being lied to by Raynor because her older brother had died 2 years ago, and the dead don't come back to life. Rial refused to listen and insisted that her brother was still alive. She was completely unreasonable and wouldn't listen no matter what Glenn said. Glenn asked Rial to step forward, and she started attacking him. Glenn realized that his mistake wasn't just hiding the truth, but also not running away with her. He really hoped Rial would listen to him. Rumia shouted, begging Rial not to attack Glenn because he was their precious teacher. Rumia also said that Rial was a valuable friend to her and Sistine. Glenn asked if Rial truly loved her brother. According to Rial, her brother was everything, and she had decided to live for him. Rial kept thrusting her sword forward. Reluctantly, Glenn used his pistol and fired at Rial, who kept dodging. Glenn said that a little sister who spoke like that made him jealous. He wanted to know more about her amazing older brother and asked for his name. Rial was surprised by Glenn's question. Raynor told Rial to finish Glenn quickly. Glenn asked Rial to tell him her brother's name, promising to back down if she did. Raynor told her not to listen to Glenn, but Glenn kept pressing. Rial tried to remember the name of her older brother, but it gave her a headache because it was so hard to recall. Raynor shouted that the name didn't matter anyway. He was Rial's older brother. At the moment when Rial was weakening, Glenn threw a pistol toward her head and immediately pushed her down to the ground. Just as Rial was about to activate her magic, Glenn slammed her head down. Raynor demanded Glenn to back off from his little sister. Glenn got annoyed and fired his research device repeatedly, hitting Raynor. Glenn called Raynor a fake. Then Rial remembered something about a resurrection project, that it was her own project. She recalled that her older brother's name was Cheyenne. 2 years ago, Cheyenne, Raynor, and Alicia were involved in this resurrection project. Cheyenne asked Rainer to stop it because, according to him, creating that girl had cost many innocent lives. Cheyenne wanted Rainer to leave the organization and planned to join the Royal Magic Court, but Rainer killed Cyan on the spot. Not only that, Rainer also killed Alicia since he already had the 3 essential elements he needed. At that moment, Rial realized she was the product of their experiment. 2 years ago, Cheyenne betrayed the organization by reporting it to the Royal Magic Court, who then raided the research lab. Glenn knew this story, and at that time, Cheyenne had contacted him. Cheyenne explained that the Resurrection Project could be completed with his pure magic, but if he left the organization, the research would stop. Shin begged Glenn to save their friends, those who had shared joy and pain since they were young, Alicia and Rainer. After that meeting, the Royal Magic Court raided the lab, but Cheyenne was already dead, and Alicia was badly injured. The Astral Code Girl was Rial. In short, Glenn protected the girl who inherited those memories until her death. Realizing this, Rial began to cry. Rainer said that he had already altered Rial's memories for his own benefit before she escaped from the experiment. But to him, trash was still trash, and he didn't need her anymore. Hearing this, Glenn got angry and immediately attacked Rainer with his magic, but 3 girls who were products of the experiment rose up to protect Rainer. It turned out the resurrection process had been completed, and the 3 revived girls were perfect. Rainer ordered the 3 girls to eliminate Glenn and Rial. They had the same power as Rial and quickly attacked Glenn. One of them tried to stab Rial with the sword, but luckily Glenn protected her just in time. Rial asked why he was protecting her when she had nothing. Glenn asked why he should protect a girl who had nothing. He continued to fight the 3 artificial girls. At that moment, Rial said she was just a puppet. Glenn responded that puppets don't have a face like hers, and even Sistine, Rumia, and the other students didn't think that way. Rial admitted she had done wrong to Glenn, Sistine, and the others. Glenn suggested she just apologize to them. Suddenly, Glenn's thigh was cut by a sword, and Rumia got really worried. Glenn told Rial to keep living for something valuable and not to burden her mind with such thoughts. Rial realized there was something precious to her. Then Rial took her sword and got ready to finish off the 3 girls. She succeeded, and Rainer didn't expect it. As Glenn approached Rainer, he tried to activate his magic, but Glenn was already activating his foolish arcane skill. Glenn pointed a pistol at Rainer's head and told Rumia to cover her eyes. Rainer begged Glenn not to kill him. Glenn lowered his pistol and punched Rainer hard in the face. Meanwhile, Albert managed to destroy Burks using his magic power. After everything was over, Glenn took Rumia and Rial back to the inn, where their friends were already waiting. Sistine immediately hugged Rumia. Rial apologized and Sistine hugged her back while crying. After that, the students had fun playing volleyball together while Glenn and Albert just watched. Albert remarked that it was actually a very precious sight. At first, it sounded like he was talking about swimsuits, but it turned out the precious sight he meant was what Glenn wanted to protect. The second-year students were having fun playing beach volleyball while Glenn and Albert were just watching from a distance. Albert told Glenn that what he was looking at was something precious. Glenn assumed Albert was talking about the girls' swimsuits, but it turned out Albert meant something far more meaningful, a precious sight Glenn wanted to protect. The ball rolled over toward Glenn and Sistine called out, asking him to toss it back. After Glenn threw it, Sistine thanked him. Suddenly, Albert commented that Sistine reminded him of Sarah. That night, Eleanor reported to her superior. The superior asked if Rumia's power was close to being complete. Eleanor confirmed it and asked what they should do next. The superior told her to simply keep an eye on Rumia for now. Eleanor added that there were people inside their organization who wanted to awaken Rumia again. Her superior left the matter in Eleanor's hands. After the school trip, Rial stayed over at Sistine's house. That night, she joined Sistine's family for dinner. Sistine's parents encouraged her to enjoy the food, though Rial seemed a little awkward and shy. Sistine explained to her parents that Rial was just a reserved person, so it would take time before she felt completely at ease with them. Sistine's father was relieved because he had thought Rial didn't want to eat at all. Filiana asked if Rial also liked Glenn, since Sistine and Rumia always spoke highly of him. Rial admitted that everything began because of Glenn. Filiana smiled, feeling even more convinced that Glenn was a good person. Leonard then invited Rial to try his cooking. Filiana mentioned that she and Leonard would be leaving for the capital the next day, and she asked the 3 girls to take care of the house while they were gone. Leonard also said he had something important to tell Sistine. Later that night, Rumia, Sistine, and Rial stood on the balcony, gazing at the sky. Rial lowered her head and apologized to Sistine about what happened before. Sistine hugged her and told her it was fine. Rumia joined in the hug, and in that moment, Rial realized just how precious her friendship with them was. The next day at school, Sistine was carrying a stack of books in the library when one of them slipped from her hands. Celica picked it up for her and mentioned that Sistine's grandfather had been a famous researcher. Sistine confirmed it and said she wanted to continue her late grandfather's dream, even though she wasn't sure she could. Hearing this, Celica gave her a piece of advice that the ones who achieve something are the fools who take action, while those who achieve nothing are the ones who just keep thinking about it. She encouraged Sistine to keep going. Celica then left for the underground labyrinth. While Sistine was organizing books on the shelves, Glenn suddenly showed up and startled her. She told him he didn't really seem like the type to be in a library. Glenn disagreed, saying he was basically a walking encyclopedia. He then thanked her for using the reviver spell to save him. Sistine suddenly remembered giving him rescue breaths at that time, and her cheeks turned red. Glenn had no idea why her face was flushing, and Sistine quickly covered her face with her hands in embarrassment. Not long after, Rubia and Rial arrived. Rubia asked what was going on and if Glenn had been bothering Sistine again. Rial looked at Glenn and declared that she would protect Rumia and Sistine. She summoned her magic and prepared to draw her sword toward him. Glenn tried to explain that it wasn't what she thought, but Rial kept attacking. Glenn ran at full speed to dodge her strikes, eventually rushing outside, only to trip and fall onto the street. At that exact moment, a horse-drawn carriage came down the road. Sistine panicked because Glenn was about to get hit, but the carriage's passengers saved him using magic. The passenger was surprised to find Sistine there, as she was the first person he had met at that place. He introduced himself as Leos, a special guest instructor invited to the academy, and also revealed that he was Sistine's fiancé. Hearing this, Rubia, Glenn, and Rial were all shocked. On their way somewhere, Leonard told Filiana he had forgotten to tell Sistine that Leos would be coming. Sistine herself was confused about what Leos had just said. Leos laughed, reminding her that they had once made a promise together. She flusteredly replied that it had been when they were just kids. Glenn walked up to Leos and asked if he was serious, even suggesting that being with Sistine was basically a death wish. Sistine was annoyed and confused by Glenn's comment. Leos looked irritated and told Glenn not to insult his future bride. Sistine tried to calm him down, explaining that Glenn was only joking. Leos was then surprised to realize that the man standing before him was actually Glenn. Back at the Kleidos Magic Academy, where Leos taught, Glenn's name often came up in conversation. People spoke of him as a rare, talented teacher who understood the core of spellcasting and focused more on practical application. Leos even said he'd like to attend one of Glenn's classes sometime. Meanwhile, in the Academy Principal's office, Rick, Hallie, and Celica were talking about Leos. Tamriga Leos had been asked to fill in for an Alzano Imperial Magic Academy instructor who couldn't teach due to health problems. Hallie felt really lucky that their school was getting help from such a talented teacher like Leos. Celica, on the other hand, seemed amused by the fact that someone like Leos would even come to their school. Hallie asked if Celica was worried that her hopeless student might be replaced by Leos, but Celica simply replied that it might not be such a bad thing. Elsewhere, Leos told Sistine that he still sincerely loved her with all his heart. Hearing this, Sistine's friends were impressed. Glenn, however, teased her by saying that normally, no one would be interested in a girl like Sistine, but maybe everyone had different tastes. He even joked that if everything went smoothly, he'd give a speech at Sistine's wedding. Annoyed by Glenn's teasing, Sistine threw something at him with force. Rial asked Rumia why Sistine seemed upset, and Rumia guessed that the whole thing was just a hassle. That day, Leos was teaching in Sistine's class. He explained about Xyzer magic energy, which was used for transduction purposes. Recently, there had been a lot of spells used by the royal military, such as heat, cold, and shock magic, and he promised they would understand why. He explained that using shockbolt magic with proper understanding could dramatically improve its effectiveness. He also mentioned that wind magic, which might seem weak from a military magic perspective, actually had unique strengths. Leos wanted to start a discussion with the students, but unfortunately, their class time was up. He wrapped things up and thanked the second-year students. The class gave him a round of applause, praising him as an amazing teacher. Glenn also acknowledged that Leos' teaching style was flawless. He could help students understand the theory of material force better than what over half of ordinary soldiers could grasp. Still, Glenn thought it might have been too early to teach such things to students. The smarter ones would realize that Shockbolt's effect depended on how it was used, and that it could take a life, but they didn't yet understand the meaning of carrying such power. All they knew was that it existed. Suddenly, Rubia asked Glenn if that kind of teaching wasn't questionable. She remembered how Glenn always told students to think about the meaning behind a power before using it, and to never stray from the right path. At that moment, she understood the point of those words. She assured Glenn that he didn't need to worry, because in the end, the students he taught wouldn't misuse their magic. Glenn admitted he wasn't worried about that. He was just jealous that Leos, who happened to be handsome, was also a better teacher. Glenn teased Sistine again, saying she had found herself a good man. Sistine pouted and walked away. Later, Leos asked Sistine what she thought of his teaching. Nervously, she said his explanations were impressive. Hearing that made Leos happy, and he remarked that Sistine was famous for moving teachers emotionally. He then said he had cleared the first step toward becoming a suitable husband for her. Irritated, Sistine told him not to talk about such things in public. Leos invited her to take a walk with him because there was something he wanted to discuss. Sistine declined, saying she couldn't right now, but Leos insisted it was something they had to talk about, even if not at this moment. Eventually, she agreed to go with him. After Sistine left, Rumia made a small request to Glenn. While walking together, Leos and Sistine were reminded of the past. Leos confessed that he had once been certain their relationship would continue to grow. Sistine realized that if they just let time pass, their connection would become nothing more than a fond childhood memory. Rumia asked Glenn to go with her to watch Sistine from a distance. Glenn wasn't particularly interested in such things. Leos, convinced that there had to be a way to keep their memories alive, asked Sistine to marry him. Glenn, who happened to witness the sudden proposal, was shocked but looked entertained, unlike Rumia, who admitted she felt uneasy about Leos. Glenn told her to just ignore it. Sistine apologized, saying she couldn't accept Leo's proposal because she had promised her grandfather that she would uncover the secrets of the Sky Castle Megalius, and for that, she needed to study magic extensively. Leos laughed, saying she was still talking about that so-called fantasy. According to Leos, the goal of magic archaeology was to uncover ancient civilizations and recreate long-lost spells. But in his opinion, no one had ever succeeded, and it was impossible and a waste of time. He even called Sistine pitiful for pursuing it. Leos went on to say that if Sistine's grandfather hadn't focused on that field, he could have achieved more in the history of magic instead. He then asked if Sistine would lend her support to his own specialty, military magic research. Unfortunately for him, Sistine turned him down, saying that just as he had his own dream, she had hers. Leos kept pressing her, saying he didn't want her to waste her life. Hearing that only made her more upset. Suddenly, Glenn appeared and scolded Leos, saying Leos should remember he was the main character of his own life. Seeing this, Leos told Glenn to get lost because this had nothing to do with him. Out of nowhere, Sistine announced that she and Glenn were lovers who had promised to be together in the future, so she could marry Leos. That statement shocked everyone, and Sistine's cheeks turned red after she said it. Luckily, Glenn quickly caught on and played along. Leos refused to believe it, saying there was no way Sistine would like someone like Glenn. To convince him, Glenn claimed that Sistine had already shared a bed with him. Sistine immediately threw him aside, saying that was way too much. After all, they had only kissed. Leos was stunned to hear they had kissed, and Sistine accidentally blurted out again that she and Glenn had indeed kissed. Glenn told Leos to give up because Sistine was his bride. Leos insisted Glenn wasn't right for Sistine, but Glenn teased him, saying that Sistine had chosen him. This irritated Leos, and he called Glenn his enemy. To everyone's surprise, Glenn then challenged Leos to a duel, and Leos accepted. After Leos left, Glenn teased Sistine for letting her words slip. He said this was his big chance. If Sistine became his wife, he wouldn't have to work anymore since he'd be marrying into nobility. Sistine threw him again in annoyance. Later in class, Glenn said he was going to give them special training in magical troop combat so that he could marry Sistine, become rich, and live as a carefree shut-in. The students were baffled about what was going on and why they were being dragged into what was clearly Glenn's personal duel with Leos. Glenn had no choice but to prepare them, since Leos insisted on testing their skills as magic instructors. Yebel said Glenn wouldn't win because the class wasn't strong enough yet. Glenn told them to keep training, promising he wouldn't forget them once he became wealthy. That night, Glenn told Albert about everything. Albert called him pathetic for fighting over a woman he didn't even seem to like, and asked if Glenn didn't feel at least a little bad for Sistine. It turned out Glenn's reason for wanting to win was so that he wouldn't have to work again. Glenn asked why Albert had contacted him anyway. Albert explained that there were reports of angel dust being smuggled into the city. Glenn could hardly believe it, since the method for making angel dust had been destroyed during last year's incident. People injected with that substance became puppets controlled by others, and that case had made Glenn sick to his stomach. Albert suspected Glenn wanted to join the investigation, but in reality, Albert had come to keep Glenn out of it. Albert questioned what Sarah's death had been for if that drug was being used again. Glenn didn't want to see it happen again either. Albert was certain Glenn saw something of Sarah and Sistine. On his way home, Glenn remembered how Sarah had admired him because he wanted to be a heroic magician who saved everyone. She had told him to have more confidence in that dream. Glenn used to call her White Dog as a nickname. He had even asked her not to worry about him, promising he would protect everyone. Meanwhile, Leos was riding in a carriage, talking with Jadis. Leos told him Glenn had challenged him to a duel, exactly as Jadis had predicted. Jadis urged Leos to do his best against Glenn, saying that this was at the core of his own sense of honor. The duel between Glenn and Leos was set as a magic court battle. Before it began, Hallie explained what a magic court battle meant, essentially a war between magic divisions. Students would line up under the command of their teacher, who acted as their commander. In this match, the students' spells were treated as military magic, and anyone considered defeated had to leave the battlefield immediately. The key to winning was all about how the commander chose when and where to move their troops. The battle would last for only 3 hours, and the winner would be whoever managed to reclaim the headquarters or defeat the enemy commander. Glenn thanked Hallie for explaining the rules. Hallie, however, couldn't wrap his head around why Glenn was using students from a prestigious academy just to duel over a woman. He hoped Leos would teach that hopeless guy a lesson. Leos smiled, walked over to Sistine, and told her not to worry about him while encouraging her to fight with everything she had. The girls who overheard were touched by his words. Leos promised he would overcome every obstacle to win her heart. Meanwhile, Glenn begged the second-year students to lend him their strength so he could get rich. Some of the boys grumbled that maybe it would be better if they just lost. Wendy teased Sistine, asking if she was really going to marry the winner of the duel. Sistine was startled and quickly said that wasn't going to happen. She had way too many things to do. In her mind, Glenn and Leos were just caught up in the heat of the moment. Still, deep down, she wondered if Glenn might actually be serious about her. The thought even made her imagine him defeating Leos and proposing to her. Realizing what she was picturing, Sistine suddenly shouted in frustration, asking herself why she was imagining marrying Glenn of all people. Riel noticed and asked if Sistine was sick, seeing her face turn red and hearing her yell like that. Rubia smiled and hinted that maybe it was true, but it was the kind of condition no doctor could cure. Ars was in charge of commentating on the match between the second and fourth years. The battle started with 3 second-year boys casting lightning magic, but Ken and Chris were taken out by the fourth years before they could even switch to wind spells. The fourth-year class was the elite, students whose power and precision far outmatched the second years. On top of that, they used a 3-person unit tactic, a fundamental magic court battle strategy that was extremely effective. Leos smiled as he watched the fight. Earlier, he had taught his class about the basics of modern magic strategy, where 3-person units were formed: a frontline attacker, a frontline defender, and a supporting mage who adjusted to the situation and backed up the other 2. Hebel had asked if that meant each member specialized in their role to gain a huge advantage against larger forces. Glenn confirmed it, adding that in a 3-person unit, if even one person acted selfishly, lives would be at risk. In magic warfare, there was no such thing as a hero. From his position, Leos tracked the second year's forces, 10 in the center field, 8 in the forest, and 1 on the hill. He suspected the 3-person unit tactic would be tough for them. He sent troops to each area to take down every second-year student. Watching the fight, the teachers assumed it would end quickly. Leos' commands were sharp, and the fourth year's movements were impressive. The second year's tactics looked sloppy, and it seemed Glenn didn't really understand magic court warfare. Hallie, however, wasn't so sure. Leos might be the best military and magic researcher around, leading a team that excelled in every area and shouldn't lose, but his opponent was Glenn. When the two sides clashed at close range, the second years started combining their magic to fight back, surprising the fourth years, who thought they had the advantage in combat strength. Yebel remembered Glenn's earlier point: there were no heroes in war. Glenn had told them that a 3-person tactic was impossible for the second years, since even skilled mages needed plenty of training to master it. Instead, he had them fight in pairs. Hallie realized the 2-person tactic was easier for students with limited practice time. One of the teachers muttered that it was shameful given the proud history of the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy. Hallie replied that Glenn would do whatever it took to win. Leos quickly understood the situation and ordered his troops to keep their distance. He contacted the long-range snipers on the hill, but they were struggling against Riel, describing her as an unstoppable force. Leos hadn't expected someone like her to be in Glenn's class. He then commanded all his troops to move into the forest, planning to use a forest-based tactic to finish off the second years. But Glenn appeared alone at the forest's edge, challenging them and luring them into chasing him. Ars was stunned to see Glenn at the front lines. The fourth-year students were fired up. If they could take down the enemy commander, they'd win the match. As they ran into the forest to chase after Glenn, he suddenly pulled a trap rope and managed to take down many students at once. With pride in his voice, Glenn shouted that when it came to guerrilla warfare, he was the best there was. Yebel and Cash could only sigh at the sight of Glenn pulling that off alone, remembering that in magical warfare, there were no real heroes. At that moment, Leos tried to contact Rukio, one of his students, but Glenn ended up answering the call instead. Leos asked if Glenn had set up that trap earlier. Glenn replied that he only did it because someone had left a trap there for fun and it just so happened to hit the mark. He then burst out laughing in delight. Meanwhile, Sistine defeated the remaining soldiers, forcing them to flee. Sistine wondered whether she should really be using such underhanded tactics to win. Her cheeks turned red as she imagined Glenn proposing to her, and she quietly admitted to herself that she felt foolish for even thinking about it. After that, Glenn ordered the students to run with all their strength. Leos commanded his side to attack all at once, but not long after, the battle time ran out. Howley announced that the match ended in a draw since there was no winner when time expired. Glenn praised his students for their performance, saying that against Leos, all it really took was a strategy like that. Cash asked Glenn if he was okay with ending in a draw, and Wendy followed up by pointing out that the real goal of the duel was Sistine. Before Glenn could answer, they heard Leos angrily scolding his fourth-year students. He even claimed that if they had simply followed his orders, they would have won. Hearing this, Cash realized just how harsh Leos could be. Glenn, however, said the students weren't the ones at fault. In his view, the soldiers lost because of their commander. Leos looked annoyed and suddenly threw his glove at Glenn, challenging him to a rematch. Glenn was surprised and asked if Leos wasn't giving up on Sistine yet. Leos firmly said he wouldn't stop until Sistine abandoned her pursuit of magical archaeology. Hearing that, Glenn declared that he wouldn't give up on marrying into nobility either. Sistine stepped in, asking them both to stop, saying they were being ridiculous because she wasn't an object to be fought over. She scolded Glenn for using cowardly tactics in battle, and added that she would never accept a proposal from someone so cowardly. Glenn quickly cut her off and set the duel for the next morning at dawn behind the school, promising it would be a one-on-one fight. Leos asked if Glenn was sure about that decision. Glenn stated motivation for winning was so he could spend the rest of his life being lazy. Hearing this, Sistine slapped Glenn across the cheek, clearly upset, and told him that she hated him. She stormed off with Rumia and Rial hurrying after her, leaving the other students confused by what had just happened. Glenn dismissed the class, saying the battle was over. On the way home, Sistine was still irritated by what Glenn had said earlier. Rumia pointed out that Glenn wasn't really like that, and that Sistine should know it too. Sistine thought back to her time with Glenn and realized she did know, but she still couldn't understand why he accepted the duel. In reality, Glenn had overheard Leos talking about wanting to crush Sistine's dream. Rumia didn't know Glenn's exact reasons, but she knew he usually avoided challenges, so there had to be an important motive behind this one. She suggested they just talk it out. Rumia didn't know why Sistine claimed to hate Glenn. She just wanted the two of them to get along like before. Sistine smiled and said she understood. Rumia also felt she should tell Glenn about the unsettling aura nearby, which looked like it was connected to Burke's. Meanwhile, Bernard, Christoph, and Albert encountered another tragic case of angel dust addiction. Christoph had heard of it before, but never imagined it could be that cruel. This was already the fifth case they had seen. Bernard was convinced that the substance had spread far wider than they had thought, and they were still trying to track down the culprit. During a carriage ride, Leos fumed about Glenn. According to Jadis, as a mage, Glenn couldn't truly match Leos. However, even if Glenn was destined to lose 99 times out of 100, he would always aim for an early victory, which was exactly the tactic Jadis had used. To Leos, Glenn wasn't on his level, and he was certain he would win Sistine. Once he did, the Kleidos family would gain full control over the female family branch, and Leos would be guaranteed the position of family head. That night, Glenn felt confident he wouldn't lose to someone like Leos, who only focused on magic research. He admitted to himself that he had been harsh towards Sistine that day, but in his mind it was the best choice, just as Sarah had wanted. Suddenly, Sistine appeared, startling him. She demanded to know why Glenn had treated her so coldly earlier and who exactly Sarah was. Sistine asked Glenn to explain why he challenged Leos, but Glenn claimed he simply wanted to marry a noblewoman to gain certain benefits. He also mentioned that Sistine reminded him a lot of Sarah. Glenn went on to share a story from the past. There was once a boy who deeply admired a heroic magician and worked as hard as he could to follow in that magician's footsteps. Eventually, the boy became a magician in the royal army. However, he was shocked to learn the limits of magic and the harsh reality behind it. The magic he once loved turned into something he began to despise. Even so, the boy never gave up on his dream because there was a girl who encouraged and supported him. Sadly, during one mission, the boy's actions caused that girl to lose her life. Overwhelmed by guilt, he gave up being a magician and shut himself away from the world. That was the end of this story. Glenn admitted that he didn't really know what he was doing now, but seeing Sistine's determination to chase her dream made him want to protect it. For him, it was a way to make amends for what happened to Sarah. Hearing Leos belittle Sarah's dream made Glenn furious, and all he wanted was to teach Leos a lesson. Even though his reason for dueling might seem childish and entirely personal, it still made Sistine feel a little happy. She knew Leos wasn't wrong in saying she was nothing compared to her grandfather. The more she studied magic, the smaller her own abilities felt to her. Still, she was glad, because even if just one person supported her dream, she felt inspired to keep pushing forward. In her eyes, the ones who actually reach something are those fools who keep moving no matter what. Her smile reminded Glenn of Sarah, and he laughed, saying that a teacher's job is to support their students' dreams. Sistine, however, couldn't understand why Glenn used wanting to marry a noblewoman as his excuse for challenging Leos. Glenn casually replied that if the chance came, maybe he really would marry into nobility. Suddenly, Leos appeared, accusing Glenn of being a coward who told his sad past just to win Sistine's sympathy. Because Leos worked in the field of magical research, he had access to classified royal army information. He claimed to already know everything Glenn had done in the past. Glenn felt threatened and told Leos to keep quiet and leave immediately. Instead, Leos questioned how Glenn could teach students with such a blood-stained past. Glenn warned him again to stay silent, adding that if Leos kept talking, he wouldn't wait until tomorrow morning for their duel. He'd fight him right there. Leos ignored the warning, telling Glenn to just go home and openly calling him a former member of the Royal Court Mage Corps Special Forces Unit Number 0. Glenn's patience finally snapped. He activated the Fool's Arcana and tried to punch Leos. However, Leos knew Royal Army martial arts and easily knocked Glenn down. Not long after, Leos used a technique called Tulpa, which could summon imaginary creatures into the real world through intense suggestion during a trance. In other words, it was the creation of artificial spirits, demons, or gods using a secret alchemy method. The creature Leos summoned easily defeated Glenn. Because it didn't use incantations, Glenn's Fool's Arcana was useless against it. Glenn fell, and Leos told him to take the duel tomorrow more seriously. When Sistine tried to help Glenn, Leos stopped her and threatened her. He pressured Sistine to agree to marry him. Leos also revealed that he knew about the true identities of Rumia and Rio, who were likely being hunted by various organizations as test subjects. Sistine desperately hoped for Glenn's help, but after that incident, Glenn didn't show up for the duel, and he stopped coming to the academy altogether.